Yo! Video games.
What up, dudes, and welcome back to the YoVideogames podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Andrew.
And once again, thank you to all our generous patrons who've kept us going for over 420 episodes. Keep it blazing.
Yeah, if you're interested in becoming a patron at any level, please check out patreon.com/YoVideogames podcast. Dude of the week is LCL Mayhem. Longtime dude, was gone for a while. Now a brand new dude again. Welcome back, dude. Good to have you.
He's been reborn.
We have a very cool episode to start the year. We've been trying to sort of move towards more behind the scenes info on the industry, specifically with like game development and of course music composition, game composition. And somehow we got lucky enough to get Alex Moukala on. He's a game composer he's done trailer music, which is where I've seen his credits. But you met him at the Final Fantasy 16 summer event.
Correct.
Talked to him for a couple hours there. And as you'll see in this episode, we talked to him quite a lot. I did most of the listening. You two really kind of got into the weeds on some stuff, which was very cool to hear.
Yeah, well, I have a lot of, I had a lot, on, I kind of wanted to like talk about or whatever, where it's just kind of like, yeah, like talking to someone who's actually a producer, composer, so it's kind of like, okay, someone who can understand, or at least give me, and more importantly, give me feedback, like on how I'm feeling about certain things.
Yeah, like what's something that maybe you aren't educated formally on, but you have a feeling about, or it's clear that you two have very similar sensibilities. So maybe he can give you that validation of like, am I correct in how I'm viewing this thing from a technical aspect?
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is very cool. And he made a suggestion that he would like to hear like you do it. That's I think that may be one of the coolest things and coolest ideas that I've ever heard is having a game composer suggest a Simmons original. I think that would be I actually like, that was, I can't think of another time where obviously someone that you respect and is doing a thing that you love so much, saying that they would like to hear your input on that thing. Like that's got to be cool as hell. And as you guys are gonna see, I tried to end the episode a couple times where I was like, okay, we're towards the end, and then we ended up just like hitting on a new topic that we all ended up going on to, and so we're starting the year strong with a 2-hour episode. We really hope you guys enjoyed. Any final thought before we hop into the interview?
No, I mean, I'm just super stoked that he wanted to do this because it's definitely a subject near and dear to my heart. So I mean, just a big thanks really to him for putting in the time to come talk to us about this. So means a lot to me. Means a lot to me.
So let us know what you think in comments. Obviously, reach out to Alex on his several YouTube channels, which he will discuss in the episode. If you have questions for him for next time, I've already gotten him to commit. He's definitely coming back. We're going to do some more about a very specific game, and we'll have to include your questions and feedback for him then. All right, here's the interview, guys.
So yeah, everyone, welcome into this crazy episode. Starting out, we have a wonderful guest. We have a music producer, music composer with us today.
Alex, thank you so much for being here. Alex
Yeah.
Moukala.
Hi, guys.
A couple of your credits, just really quick, that I saw from a quick Google is like you worked on Endgame, for instance, which
Just a TV spot, like a trailer thing.
yeah, but trailer music sells the movie, man.
Oh, and
know.
all
So cool.
and I have a
But it
lot
was
to
like-
say about trailer music.
But it was one of like, yeah, we can talk about that as like, it was one of 7,000 trailers they made for that movie. So it doesn't even feel that special. But yeah,
Fair.
I make music. It was great. It was great. But I make music, and now
Yeah,
I'm making music for games, and it's sorry.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
It's an honor to be here. I mean, I love to talk about this stuff with people, and I basically, Andrew, I think this is the first time I meet you.
This is, yeah, yeah.
I met Simmons in LA at the Final Fantasy 16 event last summer.
Yep.
And that day, so many people came up to me to talk and ask me questions and whatever, talk about music and just talk in general. And I love that. I love meeting people. And then you came, and initially I didn't recognize you. And then you started asking questions about video game music that were so specific that I'm like, who is this composer? And then turns out, oh yeah, it's Simmons. And I swear, man, I could have talked to you for like 2 hours straight, but I was trying to like spread the attention to as many people as I could that day.
Yeah.
Because I felt responsible for like entertaining.
There were so
I'm
many
glad
people
that
there too.
yeah. So I'm glad that now we have a time that we can just talk about video game music. And I'm very curious to talk about this subject with you two guys, because for me as a composer, I have some perspective. You guys are gonna have some different perspectives, but all of us here are very in love with game music, and I'm very curious to see what ideas and what considerations are gonna come out with this conversation.
Yeah.
I think an easy place to start would be with Final Fantasy. A lot of people, that's where they fall in love with game music. Final
Yeah.
Fantasy 7, for instance, or like 9. A lot of people love the music in 9. For you, where did your love, of game music specifically start?
It started with Final Fantasy VII's boss theme.
Yes.
Okay.
I remember like when I was a kid, that was one of the first games I ever played. The very first game I ever played was Donkey Kong Country, which already like incredible music from David Wise.
Wonderful music. Yeah.
But then we got the PlayStation 1 with like Crash Bandicoot and Final Fantasy 7. And I was a kid, I didn't know English at the time. I lived in Italy and the game was in English. But the language barrier didn't deter me from playing. It was so incredible. And I remember like as soon as I got the internet, I went online and I downloaded like the soundtrack from FS7, but it was like MIDI format. It wasn't even like the actual. It was like the MIDI version. And I remember
exactly what you mean.
Yeah, and I had banged like crazy to that boss battle theme, man, like that rock. Those who fight further.
Yeah.
One
one of the only 2 songs originally in Smash Bros. 4 for Final Fantasy 7 when they put Cloud in. They only had two themes, which was just fight on and those who fight further.
Those who fight further, yeah.
And I was like, really? Only 2? I was like, man, that like they're like, oh, these are great songs. These are the perfect songs. But wow, too, I was so mad about that. Like I was raising a stink for a while about it, but
but at least we got Cloud. That was an historical moment,
Oh yeah, for sure. And then it kind of hit me because being a YouTube content creator, it hit me why that was, and that's like a whole nother can of worms with the weird copyright system and stuff, and like why it had to be that way for a little while. But I got it eventually.
People don't know this stuff. I remember as a kid, I even thought like, for example, Final Fantasy X, I love the soundtrack a lot. Then 10-2 came out, which I loved still. But I was like, why are all the songs different? When I'm going back to B-side, why I'm not hearing the B-side? And then when I grew up, I was like, oh,
different?
That was Squaresoft and this is Square Enix, and the copyright didn't fully translate, and so they couldn't just do whatever they wanted. It was so fascinating.
Well, I noticed you got a VV back there, and I'm like, oh, because is that maybe a hint to the project,
the Memoria project?
Memoria.
Actually,
I do feel that's a little bit of an underrated soundtrack for Final Fantasy, oddly enough. I feel like it's really good and it doesn't get talked about as much for whatever reason. Maybe because it came out so late at the end of the PlayStation 1's life. I don't know. Like 9 was like a really fantastic soundtrack, but I guess I
agree with you. I mean,
I guess that's nothing new for Final Fantasy.
Interestingly, Final Fantasy 9, I remember I was interviewing Nobuo Uematsu like a few years ago. And I don't remember what question was that popped up, his answer, but he was talking about how when he completed Final Fantasy 6, he felt like he finally got the hang of how to write a fantasy soundtrack. And the next one was going to be way easier compared to the previous 6. And then they were like, okay, we're going to do FF7. It's going to be modern. No fantasy, like high fantasy, whatever. And so it's like, what the hell? Like now that I got the hang of it. So it feels like FF9 is that the I think the sound of Nobuo Uematsu, who mastered
That makes
a fantasy
so
score.
much sense, honestly, because it felt like this sort of, I would call it like, it felt like this refresher where it's like, oh, let me just go back to
Yeah.
where I didn't personally know that little tidbit, but it's just 9 always felt like, oh, like let me just I like an not an unwind, but it's just sort of like let me go back to it, like just kind of like resetting or recharging almost a bit, where it's just kind of like I'm going back to what I'm very familiar with 9 because of the setting and tone of that game being way more in line.
That's the whole point of the game. I
Yeah.
think. Like Final Fantasy is a weird freaking series, right?
Mhm.
Because when you have an IP that's very popular, usually like Star Wars, for example. Which okay, maybe that's a bad example because now it's branching out in
Finally.
interesting ways. But I don't know if you guys
Yeah,
saw
oh
Andor.
yeah.
Andor.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I loved Andor. But Star Wars, like for the longest time, was like okay, Jedi, Sith, lightsabers, stormtroopers. It had all these elements, right? Final Fantasy is a weird IP because it's not exactly like that. Like the first 6 are kind of like high fantasy. 7 is the first modern, and that was like
Yeah.
completely unseen. And then 8 was still kind
8
of
was
modern.
yeah.
Tactics was
Yes.
political.
Well,
So there's like different types of Final Fantasies, right? And they kind of there's like I think 3 or 4
Yeah.
types now. And FF9 was a high fantasy Final Fantasy, which came after 7 and 8. So I started 7, then I played 8, and I remember when 9 came out, lots of people were expecting another
Mhm.
modern Final Fantasy because if you were 6 years old when FF7 came out, that's all you knew. And 9 was like back to the origins, with many people
Mhm.
who picked up the series thanks to 7 and 8 didn't know.
Yeah.
And so sometimes people just don't feel strongly about that game because they missed out on the
Yeah,
previous
oh, for sure. Like
FF.
it definitely had that sort of whiplash, kind of like a little bit like Wind Waker kind of did in that sense for Zelda.
Yeah.
So like yeah, it was, but I don't know, like it still had the interesting thing about 9 was that it still had, I would say, more modern sensibilities where, it had a vocal ending theme, and then,
Yeah.
that is the world map theme in a more instrumental version. So it still kind of has this sort of like
Yeah.
modern sensibility, I guess, or at the time, I guess, the things they had like added into that stuff, I guess. But I mean, we're also talking about like, oh my god, like the difference between working on the SNES sound chip, the little Sony sound chip and a SNES versus
Oh
what
yeah.
you had with 4 CDs worth. I mean, that obviously changes so much of how you could even approach, the music.
But that's so, when we met, and subsequently, I remember we talked about specifically Japanese video game music.
Mhm.
Like, I understand that's kind of like the genre. I wouldn't say genre, but that's like the niche of music that you appreciate the most in games, right?
Mhm.
Well, because they actually have music. I mean, I'm getting ahead of my
Hater.
Shots fired
I'm
already.
getting ahead of myself here, but yeah, like that was because that was a big thing
Well,
for me, is just with in general that kind of confuses me, and that is like there seems to be a general the mentality of approach to a game soundtrack with a lot of Western. I mean, and when I say Western, I kind of mean like major published titles, not necessarily.
AAA,
Yeah,
American, European.
yeah, a lot of Canadian developed stuff. Like
Yeah.
yeah, like the sort of mentality, seems to be just very different in general. And then this year there was Sea of Stars came out, and it kind of vindicated what I thought, which is like, we have great composers all over the world. I don't feel they're getting enough. They don't get enough time to shine necessarily. I mean,
Mm.
sometimes they do, but because Sea of Stars was a JRPG style throwback game, right? And Eric Brown is the main composer on that, and he's got a really interesting music history with like industrial techno, metal, whatever, not whatever, but like just like et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And then he got really into chiptune, and that's where he got, Makes the Messenger, big heavy chiptune soundtrack that like has to balance between 8-bit and 16-bit eras of gaming. Does it beautifully, right? Now it's like, hey, now do this RPG, like a SNES, which
Mm.
is musically completely different from a Ninja Gaiden style chiptune. And he hits it. He nails it, and he hits it out of the park. But it also means you have to come up with a lot of different themes, because you're like, here's a town theme, here's a town night theme, here's this field theme, night theme for this field. Like, and we're not talking about, don't just make chiptune, kind of like upbeat, Bob music.
You
You
need
have to make
different
music.
vibes. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to make like mood, like more moody music, or like setting music, stuff like that. And he does it, and he does it really well, I feel. And to me, it was like vindication, because I'm like, yeah, this is great. This is great stuff. Like, I wish, but like, I wish it was done more. But I feel like it was only kind of done that way because of the type of game they were going with, which was a Super NES style RPG. And if you were to take a Super NES style RPG and do a modern gaming approach, which is, we have event music, and we have title screen music, and and we have fighting music, and that's kind of it. We don't really want you to be hearing anything when you're walking around or in a town or just anything.
That brings up a question from me. Like, do you think that's a style choice or a budget choice?
So before we started recording, I was talking about how, to answer this question and these doubts, sometimes a game composer's output is gonna be heavily altered by the perspective of the people he's working with on the games. And a game director specifically is the one who can really dominate those choices. Right. There's projects I've been hired where game directors are like, this is our game, this is the vibe we like, this is the sound we like, do whatever the hell you want. You can even just do stuff outside of what we like. Just, this is what we like and why we like it. But if you have ideas to introduce here, we're open.
It's a high trust environment.
And usually, yeah, and they are Canadians, and that's why. They're super like chill and like, just, we trust you, just do what you want. I'm like, this is the best. And that sort of approach, to me personally, gives me the confidence to chase very interesting ideas. Game directors who instead tell you, like, very specifically that they want some, like, you may have a game director who tells you, I love SNES games, I love their philosophy, I want a soundtrack like that, but with modern sound. I'm not saying this happened to me, but I'm just saying, like, that can happen. But you may also have a director who just, thinks of SNES soundtracks and he thinks they're old school, and just because they're old, they should be avoided at all costs. And so if you write melodies that remind that person about SNES soundtracks, they may be like, I don't like it. That may happen. Like, so I think sometimes you have, like with Sea of Stars, I think probably the reason why they went for that sound, one, yeah, they were making a game that's sort of in that vibe, but also it sounds like those people kind of grew up with those games, and so they deeply understand and deeply love that sort of sound. And I bet they would find ways to apply that mentality into a more, I would say, modern inspired game, if they cared about it, right?
Yeah, well, they're pretty small developer, like 16 people, so I don't.
Yeah, but the vision of a director is gonna really be what influences what the game can be. But I think Sea of Stars is a very interesting example and to talk back about old soundtracks from old SNES games. The reason why I feel like some people say, like, oh, those games had more soul musically than now is that, and I've been asking myself this question a lot too. I believe that because game composers were so limited back then, there was no way to make your soundtrack sound super realistic and super cool like today, right? There was no temptation. So the only thing you could do really is like use limited tools in a way that makes those tools feel way more interesting. And the way to do it is like focus on writing compositions that would sound amazing despite of what instruments they're playing on. It's kind of like, when you go out on a date, right? You can choose to go on the date, look the most smashing, wear makeup, wear a suit or whatever, and just focus on the superficial look of things. Or you can try to focus on being an interesting person by having interesting things to say. In the ideal world, you do both, right?
Yeah.
You look your best, whatever, and you also are an interesting person with a lot of heart and soul. But when you maybe don't, you don't have access to a possibility to like look sharp or whatever, you're gonna focus on being interesting as a person, right? And I feel like those SNES soundtracks could only focus on the soul of the music, and that in Japan being sort of like traditionalistic country and traditionalistic society, that became the tradition. And still nowadays, that's why I think lots of music from Japanese RPGs is very, very similar to the music at those times, but it sounds cooler now because we have you have real guitars and real drums and real orchestras or whatever.
And I really do love live instrumentation. Like it definitely, I wouldn't say it's like, oh, this is definitely better than the other, but there's a sort of je ne sais quoi a bit when you hear like the same song done with I'm just using quickly assembled whatever samples I got, and then now I went and got a real orchestra to play, and I have real live recording on it. So that's always an interesting thing because there's some games that I play where like the early trailer comes out and you hear a song and you're like, it sounds pretty good, and then the final game comes out and it's like, well, this was done with live instrumentation way after this trailer was made, same song. And it's like, oh wow, like it is the same song, it's the same melody, same composer, everything, but just something about like getting someone in there live, and then you could kind of feel out the song too, which was because I follow Mitsuda a lot, and he talks about how like he just a lot of piano themes or whatever and stuff he does, but he has a particular guy he likes to use on the piano because he's like, you can play the same song at the same notes, follow it along perfectly, but like it's going to come, the feeling is going to come out completely differently depending on who's playing the piano. So
yeah, because those same notes get like coated with layers of that person's story and soul and character, and that may not always yield the best results, but obviously like I've been in situations where I wrote a song and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna get this musician to re-record this part I wrote with a virtual instrument, and they re-record it. I'm like, this sucks now. That happens because maybe it's not a match. But I've also been in the opposite situation where I do that and the song just transforms because the person's character and story and the way they act while playing the instrument just added a new dimension to the game. It's sort of like voiceover in games. You can have a game that has cutscenes without voiceover, but then when you add voiceover, like that's why I love FF7 Remake. Like every character's story is hitting on a whole new level now that they are voice acted.
I don't know. I honestly don't know how they did. I think Hamazu was in charge of remakes overall, like music.
No, actually, he did. It's a weird thing, and this is before we started recording. We were talking about the importance.
So I know there's like multiple. I know there's technically many different people. I'm not sure who the head of sound on remake was. I think it was Hamazu, but
so this is how it happened. Masashi Hamauzu and Mitsuto Suzuki are the two guys who wrote the most original / new music that have nothing to do with Nobuo. Like, for example, the Whispers theme is Hamauzu. Jessie's theme that plays when you go to her house is Hamauzu. So they've wrote a lot of new music for new stuff. But Keiji Kawamori was the music supervisor.
Okay.
So he was the guy who kind of gave the sound and made many of the decisions, supervised everything. And Keiji Kawamori has worked with Nobuo Uematsu since Final Fantasy VIII, I think.
Okay.
So he's
long time
in Square Enix music. Is one of the people who understands Uematsu's sound the best, and that's why the FF7 Remake soundtrack, despite having something like 15 composers, it's like a lot of composers. It sounds quite uniform and it's very respectful to Uematsu's work because
and they still take some wild swings, I feel, but they somehow still
work.
Yeah. Like the area where, like when you're sneaking back home at night in the crane area and some of the night theme. I was
dude, I love that.
I'm like, I don't know how you thought, because like to me, I would have thought, hey, I want to do this with like like samples like ba ba ba. I'm like, that would be a horrible idea. You making Rugrats here or something, and then like you hear it in game. And it worked. It worked really well. And I'm like, I don't know how you knew that
requires. It requires trust. Like I'm ready to bet from the level of quality and creativity that is in the soundtrack. I'm ready to bet Keiji Kawamori is a joy to work with, and he trusts his composers a lot. And also, literally most people on the soundtrack, if not all, grew up listening to Uematsu's music.
Yeah.
Hamauzu himself was part of the choir in the original One Winged Angel for FS7.
Mhm.
Like he
Yeah.
sang in that choir.
Wow.
And he was a composer at Square at the time too, I think, or something, or close
Yeah,
by.
yeah.
The time. All the people involved are either like, love Uematsu as an idol or work with him in the past. So there's a lot of trust that surely happened in that soundtrack, and
Yeah, man.
like that's the good thing about having different composers in there,
Yeah, I mean, and if you didn't,
because each composer had his voice.
if you didn't trust that sound team before, after remake, you would have to have I would think you would have to have absolute trust in what they're doing.
Oh yeah, dude,
after that point, because I'm like, okay,
100%.
because not only like because that's a very important project for Square, obviously, but like, I mean, afterwards, I'd be like, okay, you took wild swings and they hit. You go with it, go whatever, go whatever you want to
Yeah,
go with
dude.
at that.
Does size of team
100%.
affect that level of trust? Like earlier before we recorded, we talked about this also, where it was like on a smaller team, like say Sea of Stars, the composer might be literally talking to the director of the game to get the vibes and stuff. But again, you just talked about like a music supervisor, or you might be working with the music editor. I don't know exactly how editing for game music works, but does the size of the team affect, I guess like the intimacy of the vision? Like if you're able to get feedback directly, without any other interference from the director, I imagine it would be easier to nail what you're trying to do. But if you're on a big team, I guess you have to have a go-between. Or
my understanding, and personally, I don't think I've worked with I haven't worked with AAA teams so far. I think I don't. No, I don't. I haven't worked with AAA teams. But
no, because you make
my
music and they
understanding of
don't
this-
want it.
oh,
no, come on now.
don't put the
No,
man in a
AAA teams
corner.
are amazing.
No,
No,
there
I have a lot.
there are really, really good AAA.
I have a
soundtracks.
lot of friends who work on AAA games, and they are phenomenal. Like the whole team. My only okay, actually, I did a AAA collaboration sort of with the Santa Monica studio. I did some official God of War lo-fi remixes, and that kind of
right. I remember that.
Cemented. Yeah, it kind of cemented the suspicion I had, which is the bigger, at least the more a joy they are to work with. Kind of like I feel like the bigger a team is, usually, the more trust they give you, the more they understand that giving trust to people is sometimes a good
Yeah,
creative
and it
decision.
maybe.
While smaller teams sometimes will less.
Oh, go ahead. Finish
Yeah.
the thought. I'm sorry.
No, and at the same time, sometimes I wouldn't say this is always the case, but people who are just starting out tend to be more controlling.
Yeah.
I see.
That's what I feel sometimes.
I was gonna say, do you think
However,
maybe because if the team is super big, there's so many moving parts, we don't have time to I can't sit here and micromanage every little thing. Like I'm trusting you, to help this along because because maybe a project might be so big or.
well, I guess the sound, like the sound. That's why you have like a game director and like music director, sound director, etc. In that case, the music director is going to be following you. No, but I really feel like that people, if they ask you to work on a AAA thing, people just trust you a lot by default, right? And like to get in that door, you must be doing something good, and they already vetted you. But I also feel like they understand the value of trust in creativity, and I feel like, okay, if you did a terrible job, they would tell you, obviously.
Yeah.
But to me, usually the more experienced, bigger the client is, the easiest it is to work with them. I don't know why that is,
Well,
but
it's kind
just,
of
that's how it is.
interesting too, where like one of the biggest games in gaming is Call of Duty, and they started like, oh, we're bringing Trent Reznor in for some of their projects, and then one of Hans Zimmer's interns got brought in for Hans Zimmer. I say that facetiously, but
I'm not sure what happened there.
It's a rumor.
I can't confirm.
Yeah.
No, I forget, there was some movie project that got announced recently. It might have even been a game project, and they're like, Hans Zimmer's gonna return on this, and someone's immediate reply was like, congratulations to unnamed intern number 47.
There's a rumor that that Hans Zimmer, if it's not like a huge director, not even a big name movie, like if it's not a big name director, he hands it off to an intern to do 99.9% of the work, and then he like comes in and
I'm not
but
I'm not entirely sure how Hans does things.
Nah, I just wanted to
But
throw that industry
the
joke for
topic of
Andrew there.
no, but this is a thing, like the topic of ghost production, right? And composers having teams. Everybody does this completely different. And so there's some people who do this in a way that is like unethical, and there's also people who are like, no, I want my team to like be getting it. I want my team to get the attention. I want my team to be celebrated.
right.
So yeah, you guys like are touching a topic that is so I think important for sure, and happens a lot. I don't know about game soundtracks, but in film soundtracks, for example, yes. And there's many reasons why people work with teams, but unfortunately, not everybody credits them properly. Many people do, and I think Hans Zimmer does actually. I'm not sure, to be fair, but I have some friends who work there, and when they publish soundtracks that they made in that studio, their names are also there. So I don't really know how that works, but every composer is a different situation.
And I had a
And
friend
sometimes it
who
can be
was
unfortunate.
that an intern who ended up working for him for a while, who loves him. Like it was just, but it is a fun rumor.
Yeah.
It is very funny to assume.
Yeah.
Well, going back
Yeah.
a little bit towards AAA and stuff, and I kind of like I'm kind of curious what your take or what your, I guess maybe just opinion maybe on this is, and that is, why is it in so much AAA space and even like games with legitimately good soundtracks? Because there was times where I was playing Spider-Man 2 and I thought, wow, this music's really good, in certain parts of Spider-Man 2. And the same with God of War. And I don't understand why this keeps happening where they're like, we have area themes. Oh, we have themes. Like, okay, like an example would be like, you enter an area, it plays about a minute to a minute and 30 of a track, right? Like it kind of like queues up like to play if you enter an area, you fast travel to an area, or dawn comes, like, goes from day to night. Or they have these little like triggers, I guess I could say, in world, and it plays about a minute of sort of mostly ambiance style, or just like, oh, this is the setting for this thing, and then it just drops, it goes away. Because and I don't, and I'm like curious to your opinion on this, because to me it's almost infuriating. It's because it almost feels like like the game is like waving to you, like, we had a theme here, here's a theme, okay, bye now. like like
So for me personally, like, I find with many things in life, and this one too, I always find myself in the middle. Like I love the Japanese approach of like making music as bombastic as possible constantly, kind of like Xenoblade Chronicles, like all the Xenoblades, but especially 3. You're in the first area, you fight some random bugs, and freaking the composers go insane. Like you hear the soundtrack, and you're like, I'm fighting an enemy who's gonna die in 10 seconds, and I'm hearing like crazy guitars and crazy funky bass and flutes and orchestra and everything, and it's the best thing I ever heard. And it's just a random bug.
Yeah.
And then you're like, okay, what the hell? How are you gonna even top this when you have to do a boss theme? And then somehow they even top it.
yeah
And then you're like, okay, well, but what about when I'm facing the actual definitive bosses, like the Moebius robots or whatever?
Yeah.
And then the music gets even more intense, and it's like ridiculous. It's actually ridiculous, and it's amazing, and it's like super intense, and it's extremified as much as it can be. And they're not really concerned with like, oh, this is unrealistic, or it's a bit unbalanced to like write the most bombastic music for every random encounter. But they don't care. They're just like, they want to make each scene strike you as much as possible. And that's sort of like, I would say, like the Japanese sort of perspective. This doesn't mean that every Japanese developer is like this, but for the most part, anime, video games, they tend to be more on the extreme because they think that's more valuable. Well, the Western perspective is kind of the opposite of that, where they're like, subtlety is more important, because a Western composer, then again, that's not everybody,
right? Yeah,
but
of
it's
course.
more like, well, I want to be able to strike you super strong in very specific parts, and in order to do this, I need to like tame the music in many other parts. So very rarely would you have a game like God of War where the music, you fight a random enemy and the music is like freaking insane. Some composers see that extremification of music as a turnoff,
Yeah.
And that's just, it's just it's a stylistic choice. The decision to introduce an area with like 1 minute of music and then fading it away, even I am like, I don't know, like must be like some for me personally, the best example of music implementation that I can think of is Genshin Impact. Probably Genshin Impact kind of, you explore, you have a track that kicks in 2 minutes, 3 minutes or something, it's very nice, and then it fades off. You have a few moments of silence, and then another track comes in, and it's not the same piece
Yeah.
of music, but it's a piece of music in a similar vibe. And they base those in regions. Like if you're in Inazuma, you're gonna hear a certain type of music. If you're in Mondstadt, you hear a different type of music.
Yeah.
And that sort of approach, which is I think taken maybe from Breath of the Wild, gives you moments to enjoy the music and gives you also moments to enjoy the silence. So I freaking love that approach. But with, I don't know, some Western games, it's like you said, and I wonder why they do that choice. It doesn't bother me that much though, because there's so much to take in a game.
Yeah.
And sometimes letting music not speak makes you notice it more when it comes back. So I suppose maybe that's what
Yeah.
they're banking on. But if you're the type of person who loves to be accompanied by the soundtrack the whole time through, that's surely gonna.
It strikes me as odd where it seems like there's a mentality amongst some, obviously some, not all, like some game directors where it's like, I don't want you to notice the music. I don't want the music to stand out.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want the music to like upstage what we're trying to do. And I'm like, does that sound insulting to the composer? I don't want your work to be noticed a bit. Like I know that's not generally the idea, but like it almost kind of sometimes comes off like that. Where I've read that with like some interviews or talked to some people in the industry, like I don't want my music to overshadow or stand out. And like I get the overshadow thing because like I think there's like levels to like bombasticness in, especially in Japan, where like, okay, you have Sawano and the man is just at a 20, on a scale of 10, at a 20 all the time. The man is like the definition of bombastic, and bangers, yes, but like you definitely have to almost. It's almost like you got to be in the mood when you listen to one of his soundtracks because it's just gonna just start like exploding, like it's a fireworks show. And then there's other composers who are way more like, we have music all the time, but it's way more like a little more subtle, subdued. Yeah, a little toned down.
I think sometimes it's the composer's choice. Like sometimes really it's the composers who want the music to not be noticed until a specific moment. I've been asked, "Hey, I want your music to be less anonymous, or I want your music to blast all the way through," and I'm like, "Oh, okay, but what about the players? Maybe they're gonna hate. Like by the third time this loops, they're gonna be like, okay, that's enough." And I'm kind of notorious for like writing music in a way that's kind of maximalist, and as long as it's like music that is on YouTube or Spotify, people can listen and stop, that's fine. But if they have to listen to it over and over, my fear always is like, oh, they're gonna get bored of it. So I find myself sometimes being like, hey, what if we
that's
like make it in a way that the music lowers in intensity after a while, and the director's like, no, this is great, I'm gonna listen to it 30 minutes straight. I'm like, okay, that's cool. I hope the players will too.
That really touches on
I've never been in a situation.
Yeah, I was gonna say that touches on an interesting point where it feels like the hardest thing, honestly, if you are gonna be writing constant music, is how do you make it like not just loop, because that's a whole thing of like, does it smoothly loop, but also will this sound great the 5th, 10th time, 20th time, if you're in an area, you're just hearing it over and over.
Right? To like again to mention Xenoblade Chronicles again. You guys played all 3 games? Did you play all 3 games?
I've played them
I have
ad
not.
nauseum. He's not.
He's
I played them
to
ad
death.
nauseum.
Yeah.
I have.
No, I know you
do. The soundtracks right there behind.
So it was a very elegant way to ask Andrew, hey, have you played? Because I know, Simons, you have played all of them.
Yeah, I have not.
But well, their Xenoblade, I think, is notorious for having some of the best exploration themes that you can listen to over and over, and they will never tire you. And when you have that challenge, because like again, Japanese game developers tend to be more like, oh, I want this to be a banger all the time. And okay, if you have an area that's like, okay, people are gonna spend half an hour here, then you have a challenge which is like, I need to write a banger that needs to be so engaging that people keep listening to it and keep enjoying it.
over and over.
That is a problem that I'm like, I've had this situation just last month. I was pulling out my hair, guys. It's so hard, you know. And when you make use of silence, you're like, oh well, I'm just gonna let silence command here, so I don't have to face this problem. That's good. But if you're faced with this problem, like I need to write something that keeps looping and keeps stays interesting, that leads you to I feel make music in a different way, and that's literally like the reason, or rather, the way in which I solved this issue when I was faced with this problem was listen to Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Roaming the Wastes, and I
Oh
I
my
I
god, what a banger.
analyzed and reversed engineered that track like I never did before, and I was like, I see sound. Like it blew my mind the things I've noticed, and in the reasons why it's such an engaging track, and I learned a lot.
Where did you learn to like analyze music? Did you go to school for music, or did you just like from childhood you paid so much attention to music and like came up doing it, or like because you say analyze the sound, and to me, like again, I love music. I don't think there's anybody on the planet that doesn't love music, but like I don't.
There's that
If I
one
watch a
Star
movie,
Trek
I can
producer.
analyze it. You know, like if I watch a movie, I can analyze the visuals. I like, but I learned how to do that for the last 15 years. So I'm just curious, like, where did that start for you?
I think in a similar way to what you know, I'm pretty sure that Simmons probably has the same origin story in a way. I'm very surprised that Simmons is not like that you're not a composer, Simmons, because when I talked about music with you, I was like, you notice details in a way that goes beyond the norm, kind of. And when I remember when I was a kid, I listened to songs I like from games or radio or whatever. And the thing that led me to understand them on a different level is I would sing along not to the main melodies, but to like, I don't know, secondary melodies
Right.
or counter melodies. But I would sing like along to the bass lines or things that were in the background that you hear but you were not really supposed to hear. I would always notice those and I would like, oh, this part is so cool too, and I would sing along to all that stuff. And that habit of singing to the counter melodies, singing to the bass lines, led me to perceive music kind of different. And when I became a composer 10 years ago, I didn't go to music school. I just I don't know. I think 19 or something. Probably yeah. It wasn't 10 years ago. It was a bit longer, I guess. But I was 19 years old. I started making music from scratch and by ear and without music theory. And I figured very quickly that it would bore me to death to learn music theory and books. And so I decided to learn by reverse analyzing music that I like. And I remember I took songs like, for example, I took The Landing from Final Fantasy VIII, and I decided to rewrite it entirely by ear. So I would listen to the song like 7,000 times, and each time I would just write down in my software FL Studio, rewrite the instruments, trying to get them to sound as close as possible to the source material. And that exercise really helped a lot. And obviously, like making music all the time and writing loads of music and trying to study from tutorials online and courses or whatever led me to understand it a bit more deeply. But this exercise of taking a song and just rewriting it by ear led me to be able to analyze music like I do. And there's different ways to go about it, right? This is my way, but there's other people who analyze music with the sheet music or
Interesting. Yeah.
I see that and I'm just kind of like, wow, that's interesting. I wish I have a very very basic knowledge of how like looking at sheet music or like looking at the full orchestra, for okay, this instrument here comes in here, blah blah blah, whatever. But I'm like, how would I write
can't
that?
read. I can't read sheet music. Maybe one day I will learn, but I've been very specific about the way I learn how to make music.
Well,
and all this stuff.
I think it was Paul McCartney never learned how to read music, and he's Paul McCartney.
Hans Zimmer also.
Yeah,
I think
there you go.
Doesn't read. No, there's so many ways to make music. And yeah, for me personally, I've always been obsessed with.
There was a very interesting thing you pointed out very recently, which was the trailer music for Tears of the Kingdom, which was like a lot of people really get into the saxophone part of that trailer, but you pointed out like it's not just the sax, because if you just play this, if you take that music and you just play the saxophone alone, it actually doesn't sound that great. It's that the sax is being supported by a couple other instruments and stuff underneath it to sort of like pick it up, hold it up. which I thought was a really interesting thing because for it kind of is interesting how like sometimes people hear the one instrument and kind of like it stands out for them, but like they kind of you don't understand like you needed multiple instruments within that track to boost up what that is. And and I guess I kind of want to like point out something else too, which was Ascension in 16.
Oh yeah.
So here's the thing. You're gonna hate me for this, but I was outside of boss battles in some character themes. I was slightly underwhelmed with some of 16's music. A little bit. But that was mostly field and town themes, which were good. And I always have to appreciate they were very good, but I was kind of surprised at how kind of like, I guess,
standard.
I guess maybe standard,
Like-
but then you get to these other ones where like, okay, well, we're having these big moments.
Yeah.
Something hit me, and I think you when you pointed out in Ascension, it hit me. It's because you have like a soloist violin. And I think that's something that gets lost in a lot of battle themes, where a lot of battle themes tend to just be like, okay, just have a lot of guitars riffing, just like, you just yeah, keep that energy really high. And I'm like, but then when I think about that, like a lot of battle themes start to blend together in my head when they tend to just kind of go with the same thought process behind it. And then something like Ascension, which is we have this moment in the boss. It's not even the whole track, because the whole track's very long, but like they have this like almost soloist violin part come in the later half of the music track, and that's what makes it stand out, because it sounds like you're highlighting something like a solo performer, and that's why it hits really hard. That's why you remember it so well. And I kind of wonder, kind of what you're kind of speaking, I guess, to that effect,
Well-
where with like battle themes in particular and stuff like that, and how you make things stand out from
You're preaching to the choir right now. I think about this a lot. I've been writing orchestral music for a while. Like orchestral is actually my favorite sort of like register or genre or niche of music to write. Most people think I'm just a bass guy. I love bass. I love electronic music to death, but I love orchestral music also, probably more.
Because I found I think it's your SoundCloud. I went and listened to some of your stuff, and like I that's a lot of that is I guess I might be wrong about this, but like is bass and is techno is like there's a lot of that there.
There's a bunch of that. I love that as well. Like, but I feel like I love orchestral music a little bit more.
Okay,
Just a little bit more, not that much more, but a little bit more. I love all music, but when it comes to like writing, I'm like, dude, orchestral music is so fun. And I remember when FS7 Remake soundtrack, like FS7 Remakes, the first game wasn't out yet. Just the demo was out, and people just heard a few tracks. I remember a conversation online that kind of irritated me. That makes me think about this subject we just talked about, how the importance of a solo violin on a boss theme, right? Those are people who were talking about the FS7 Remake soundtrack, and they were like, wow, judging from the demo, I'm not very excited because the music is just orchestras, and orchestras are boring. I'm like, dude, orchestras have so many instruments in them. I do not think an orchestra is boring, but there needs to be said, there's also soundtracks that don't use orchestras properly. And that's why people start to think like orchestras are boring, because there's so many example soundtracks that are like, oh, well, I have the sound of an orchestra. It sounds grandiose. I don't have to write something that sounds interesting, because already by default, it sounds interesting. It's like a person going out on a date and she's beautiful, but she's empty inside. And she's like, but I'm beautiful. I'm like, nobody gives a shit. You need to have substance, right?
Right.
So sounds like cooking. This sounds like cooking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it looks good, it is good. No, if it looks good and it tastes good, it is good.
And
if it
it's
looks
like
horrible, but it tastes good, it's good.
You have like levels of flavor, which is what an orchestra should offer you. And if you're, like just because something's spicy doesn't mean that the rest of it has to not taste
exactly.
good.
And so I find myself, because I love to write in orchestral style, I do find myself very oftentimes impressed by the sound quality, or like just the raw sound of an orchestra. I'm like, this is so fucking dope. And then I'm like, okay, let me take this track that I wrote and I'm gonna arrange it for piano. I'm like, oh, now it's shit. Okay, I've wrote a piece of music that actually is superficial and doesn't mean anything. Doesn't have a soul. And I find myself asking myself, okay, but okay, well, why does Dancing Mad stand out so much? And then I analyze the track, and I'm like, wow, it has like a grandiose orchestral sound, but some instruments carry the track like a solo vocalist would carry an opera orchestration or something, right? And lots of people love vocal music. Like Final Fantasy XIV has lots of boss themes that have vocals in it, and people go crazy for those because a vocal performance carries a piece of music in a way that very few instruments are able to do. Because you can do so much with your voice, so much detail, and you carry so much story with the vocal performance. But if you write for an orchestra and you don't have an instrument that carries that orchestration like a vocal would carry a rock track, then it's very easy for people to just perceive the sound of an orchestra as this wall of sound that doesn't have a definite shape or a definite path it's taking you. So the violin in Ascension is that. It's like the leader of that specific section that takes you on a whole journey, while the orchestra in the background is making the journey look so much more impressive. But the violin is holding your hand and taking you through this incredible piece of music, which is Ascension. And it's written in a way and with a level of detail that makes it sound like that.
See, because and the thing I really like about Ascension 2 is that like the violin feels like a duel. It feels like a fencing match almost.
Yeah.
That's the feeling I get, because it is a one-on-one between Bahamut and Ifrit, whatever. And it's like, okay, here we have this soloist violin, but it feels like you're literally not tangoing, but like you're literally in this fencing duel, with it,
And the reason why it sounds so cool is that, the rest of the orchestra is you have this massive choir and these like, strings, and it's so sparse and huge. But the solo violin is like very tiny as a sound by comparison. So there's also this contrast where you're like, oh, wow, this sounds so cool. And the track, like there's other parts where the choir is the one leading. And the best tracks in Final Fantasy 16 have some of the best choirs in it. And I think they're recorded live, and they have lyrics, and the lyrics tell the story, and there's so much detail in the way they're recorded. And that's why like tracks like Find the Flame are so fucking insane. Like that's some of the incredible.
I think there's also an engineering side to 16's like boss fights, because when you're seeing more wide shot of, say, like the creatures like throwing giant fireballs at each other, that's when you have like sort of like the full orchestra going, the full choir going. And then when it's like, okay, they'll do the thing where like the zoom in and it's like it's laser focused, where like Clive is like looking straight into whoever's face, and that's when you bring in like you highlight the solo violinist, because then it's like this. It's like you're on a battlefield and you're like squaring off against your nemesis square in the face, and like everything around you sort of like fades, and you're just like intently focused on the one person right in front of you. And that's where you bring in like sort of like highlighting the one instrument or whatever, or the one vocalist, whatever. So I mean that's why like these are very impressive about that stuff too. So and
it makes you hope that you have a full soundtrack that is like that from start to finish. But the amount of tracks they made for that game is so big that it was impossible. My only gripe with it is I would have loved to have city themes that are different. I know you don't get to explore like the actual big city, like you see Rosaria, but you don't get to hang out in the Empire of Sambrek
right
before certain things happen. And when you do, it's not, I mean,
no spoilers.
But all the small towns and stuff, I'm like, wow, I kind of wish that they had their own small theme.
And I think I pointed that out too. And in there was some, because like I know you were kind of on this train, and I went and re-listened to most of it. Your game did this really well last year was Octopath Traveler 2, which got completely ignored, by the way, by everyone. And that music is so good. And I have to say, I actually loved the thing they did for night themes, where a lot of times night themes will do like piano or slow, but they like, hey, let's put vocals in the night themes, because it's going to have this, like, it's like, let's do this. Everyone does like the sort of slower piano version or whatever, the slower strings, but like they put like vocals in the night themes. I'm like, well, that's an interesting take, and it works, and it paid off very well. I thought too, and that's a really good soundtrack. And there's like so many tracks in that game, and character themes, and
there's no vocals in the daytime versions,
right? Like, well, I mean, a lot of them don't have, say, vocals in the daytime theme, but the nighttime theme they actually use either sometimes like a solo vocalist or sometimes more of a small choir. Sometimes depending on which nighttime track and which area it
Oh, that
is. And
is cool. Yeah.
I was like, that's an interesting take there. Like, I actually
Yeah.
like what they're doing with that. I just
Well-
wish I wish I liked that game
Oh,
more than I did because like it's the music is so good and the music was carrying me for what I did play the game. But um, my personal gripe with Octopath is I feel like it needs a word editor because the games get so wordy and the characters aren't even moving.
Mm.
Nothing's really happening. You get a lot of just like static sprites just staring at each other, and there's just so much text. And then eventually I just start like I not zone out, but I'm like, oh my god, there's so much dialogue. Triangle Strategy was the worst about it, I feel, but like. But yeah, I can say I play those games. I'm like, I wish I liked these games because man, these soundtracks, man, they're on another level. Like
There's many games that maybe are not as popular and have soundtracks that deserve an insane amount of love. But
here,
you know,
yeah, and here's the thing, and this is what galls me, and I've actually stated this multiple times. Like, I guess I can use the Game Awards as an example because it's the biggest example, and people are like, why is things like? Because here's the thing, I know people who are frustrated who are on the actual, I know people who were are actual judges, on their panelist, and they basically like the way it's done is it's very much like the Oscars. Not everyone plays or listens to everything
course.
in the nominated. Very few.
Yeah.
They usually like, hey, what do you think? And like, because you'll get a whole outlet and they'll be like, one guy will have maybe played, a game nominated, and he'll be like, yeah, it's pretty good. And then the other people, well, four of us played this game. You say this is really good, but yeah, we didn't play it, so we're just gonna go with this. And it's like they didn't even hear the other game, right? And I think
Right.
that's kind of probably what happened to Octopath because it didn't even get
Yeah, I mean,
nominated.
it's unavoidable, but so I don't really rely too much on like stuff like the Game Awards, etc. To as a consumer to find out what's cool. Like sometimes the Game
Right.
Awards leads people to discover incredible things like Hades.
Mhm.
When it won Game of the Year, lots of people were like, "Oh, I need to try this game," and thank God they did. It's an incredible game.
Yeah.
And even like the Game Awards
Also
may
very
introduce people
good.
to people like Pedro Eustache, like the flute guy. That
Yeah,
he's a freaking legend. He's been a legend for many years. Lots of people didn't know him until
Kenny
he became.
knows him as a family friend too.
Oh,
Which
that's
he was
amazing.
like Kenny saw him and me like Pedro, and he's like, oh, he's my friend, he's a friend of my family, and like Kenny knew him before anyone discovered him.
I saw him live at several Hans Zimmer concerts, and he was doing his thing, and I'm like, who is that guy? This is freaking incredible. And then when I saw him at the Game Awards, and people went insane, I'm like, oh, finally, people are starting to discover this man. So stuff like Game Awards can really portray or like promote things, and I'm like, that's great. But I don't only rely on that as a consumer
Right.
to find out what's cool, and especially like with game soundtracks, I find that. I mean, I'd love to live in a world where people just are curious enough to check out a soundtrack, even if they haven't played the game. Because
Yeah.
many of the soundtracks that inspire me the most are not from games that are very popular or games that I even
Yeah.
played.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Just because we're getting towards the end of the episode, that brings up a question that I really wanted to ask at the beginning, and then I forgot because we got into, went down the line. But you just said like there's games that not a lot of people know about that you really love the soundtrack. You wish people would have played it, and for me, I feel like Bastion is a game that I've never replayed. It's a great game, but I've listened to the soundtrack hundreds of times. It's one of the only games where I've listened to the soundtrack over and over again, and I wouldn't even call it like a huge game. But a good game, but the soundtrack just like blows me away. Maybe Doom 2016 for some people who love metal. I know a lot of people who work out to the Doom soundtrack.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So what's a game where you're just like, the game's good, it's not a bad game, but this soundtrack blows me away and I listen to it all the time? Like, do you have a game?
Cerberus, Final Fantasy VII.
Okay, yeah,
and to be honest, and also Final Fantasy 13, which as it is on brand for Final Fantasy, it's been now like 13 years or something since it came out. No, more than that. And finally now people are starting to be like, oh, it's a good game. It was a good game all along, in my opinion. It has its bad side, of course, like Dirge servers. But dude, Hamauzu went wild on those games. He went insane.
Yeah,
And there's a game called Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go.
Last
Keep
one.
going. No, keep
Another
going.
one that comes to mind
all
is
of
like
them.
Fantasian. I don't know if you guys played it.
Fantasia.
No, it's stuck in Apple jail, and I'm so mad about that.
Right.
I'm
Well,
furious.
it's a game from basically same composer, like Nobuo Uematsu, composer of Final Fantasy, and the creator of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi.
Yeah, I'm so mad about
thing.
this. It's
And
stuck
and
in-
the soundtrack is, dude, it's a leap in the past in the best way possible, and it's amazing. It has some very emotional themes. But
have
there's
you
many
heard-
soundtracks that I'm like, yeah, it's so good, but the game I haven't
have
played
you,
it,
have,
or
have you
or
heard Last Story soundtrack?
I'm getting there. You know what I heard recently that blew my fucking mind? Lost Odyssey.
Yeah,
soundtrack.
yes, Lost Odyssey as well.
There's
Yeah.
the track, The Never Ending Journey. I'm like, dude,
I
this
think
is
I've
one of
heard
the
that,
best
yeah.
exploration themes ever made. And a fair amount of people played Lost Odyssey, but lots of people did not. But I'm like, dude, okay, you didn't play it, but it's Nobuo Uematsu. Just check out this soundtrack. It's fucking
Yeah,
ridiculous.
it's kind of because there was that weird period, where like Sakaguchi were like left Square, and then he was doing his
Yeah.
Mistwalker thing, and Uematsu definitely came along, and yeah, like Lost Odyssey was kind of one of those games. I can't remember if did Uematsu do Blue Dragon as well. He might have.
Yeah, I think it did.
Yeah, and then there was The Last Story on the Wii, which Nintendo didn't even publish in North America. And it's got a really, really damn good Uematsu soundtrack, and it's a Sakaguchi produced game, and it's pretty good. It's pretty darn good. I have the collector's edition because like I snatched it up right away. What I mean, like to be honest, like there was that period where like we didn't know if those games were even going to come out of Japan at all, so we all played imports of them. And then when they came to North America, I snatched them all up, physical as fast as I could or whatever. That's a really good one. There's a game I have to shout it out always, and no one's heard of it, no one's played it. So there was a game on the DS called Sands of Destruction. It was a little Sega JRPG. It was meant to be a sort of Masato Kato, who was one of the prominent writers during the SNES era. He wrote a lot of the helped with the scenario for Gears, Chrono Cross director, writer. Anyways, he wanted to make like a really dark kind of like, heavy themed RPG. And then that kind of got taken, that had to get way scaled back from Sega. We're like, no, we want to make this an anime multimedia project. You can't have it be this dark and depressing. And so it had an anime that was apparently terrible. And it had a Nintendo DS game, and the title track is called Time's Arm, and it is the most beautiful piece of music you've ever heard in your life.
On a DS.
It has I believe it has a boys choir soloist with I think the Bratislavia Symphony Orchestra behind him, and it's a fully orchestrated with like a soloist a boys choir singer, and it's the title theme for this game, and it's the most beautiful thing you ever heard, and it's for this absolute trash JRPG.
That can happen. This is like one of my nightmares. The idea of, because very few people, like, making a game takes so much time, right? And it's a process filled with passion. I don't think there's people who set out to make a game and they're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna do the worst work possible. And
that's the thing I always tell people too. I'm like,
lots of people are super passionate.
Yeah, like no one sets out to make a bad game. Nobody does.
So my nightmare is like, the idea of like, oh, I'm working on this, I'm putting so much into it, as I always do. And then maybe the game doesn't do well. And it doesn't even have to be because the game is bad. Sometimes it's just that week something else got published, or the game comes out. Like, I have a friend who wrote music for a game that was like a online multiplayer game for the most part. And the day they published it, there was some problem with servers. And so most people were just like, oh, this is a buggy game. They fixed the servers after like a week or something, but that was too late. Nobody played that game simply because the servers were fucked.
Wow. Yeah, I remember friends who worked at Sony, and Resistance 3 came out, and it had this really terrible online server issue at launch. Took 2 weeks to fix, and they're like, it's really unfortunate because that game was really good, but no one knows it because everyone left.
Nobody's gonna play it
because after 2 weeks it was done. Like they're like, man, it really sucked. So yeah,
Yeah.
I hear that all the time. I guess kind of one of the thing I guess to find like for my final thought is like, and this is what I talked about back at the launch event, and for me specifically, why do I like game music? Why am I such champion for it? Is that um I feel that game music can kind of do something that even film and film and TV can and streaming can do this. And I'm not saying they can't, but it's like something that's a little bit more like geared towards game music is that when you're in a game, you're usually in a level or an area for an extended period of time or whatever, right? In a film, it's like however many seconds or minutes. But in a game, you create an area, and then it's like you have all this work that goes into the visuals, and the map, the map placement, and all this stuff, right? And the side quests and the NPCs and everything. And for me, what I love most is saying I'm taking a long drive. I'm taking a long drive to visit my parents or whatever, and I can just put on a game soundtrack,
Mm.
and I listen to it start to finish, and I listen to all these field and town themes and event themes as well and battle themes, and I feel like I'm going through the pages of a book because
Mm.
that field theme is a character. The theme of that area, if done, not just like, hey, we have one field theme and it plays through every field in the
Interesting.
game, but
Yeah.
like it is part of the character as much as the color theory, as much as the like art style, whatever. Like it is part of the character of the game. It is part of the character of the world. No one will. You cannot look at any underwater level in Donkey Kong Country and not think of aquatic ambience. Aquatic ambience is part of the
Yeah.
character of that game. That is the character of that level. And that's why I value so much of having a rich soundtrack in every spot. And I'm always kind of like I'm frustrated beyond belief with games that don't do this, and especially games. For me, Zelda's is like this big like I kind of hate where the series has gone musically, because not only is it just do they not really have field themes, they have that sort of piano theme, the da 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 dun dun dun,
Hmm.
and that plays anywhere you are on that map, pretty much. Like you could be anywhere, desert, top of a snowy mountain, in some, and morning comes, and that is the jingle you get. You get the morning jingle. And it feels like there's all these. I feel like a lot of really hard work was done to make all those areas in that game stand out on that world map. It's a very beautifully designed world map. It is, and it kind of frustrates me that there's not like there's town themes for like a couple of the towns, but there's not like this. I can't sit there and listen to the soundtrack and be like, oh yes, I remember running through this part of the Gerudo Desert. I remember, oh yeah, I remember that part of Snow Peak or whatever.
Yeah.
So to me, I why I love game music is because I feel like game music is telling a story. It's like reading you a book without saying a single line of dialogue, unless of course there's
Mm.
unless of course there's lyrics in the song. but but like
I'm
yeah,
kind
that's
of for me again. Like I'm always in the middle, and with this coming to Zelda Breath of the Wild as somebody who played the older Zeldas, I was like, it's kind of weird. I mean, I have memories of like fun memories, the Wind Waker sailing theme and all the
yeah.
Dragon Roost Island and all this stuff. I'm like, kind of like you said, exactly like you said. So when I played Breath of the Wild, I'm like, why is it so silent? Um, but then over time, very quickly, I started to actually get into it. I'm like, I never noticed the sound of the wind or the sound of like birds or the sound of like I don't know a cricket flying away in a game as much as I have in Zelda Breath of the Wild. So I really started to feel like that sort of silence dragged me into the game more and made time pass in a way that felt um, like it felt like I don't know. I could play this game forever and I wouldn't notice the amount of time passing because there was no track that keeps looping. And I'm like, okay, I heard this track for 20 minutes and it feels like
Mhm.
20 minutes have passed. There's no music sometimes. So I'm like, oh, and also when you enter towns and you hear the music, the
Mhm.
themes, the Rito village and the Kakariko village, etc.
Yeah.
It really strikes you because you're like, oh wow, it sounds alive. And the reason for it is like, well, you're in civilization where before you're in the wild
Right.
alone. And it kind of over time I started to replace automatically this feeling of longing for music with the sense of wonder for how they tackled making you feel like in a post-apocalyptic world, timeless world, and making
Yeah.
you feel alone in the wild, and make you feel in the wild because you hear all the sounds. And I am ready to bet that the first approach they had was, let's just do the Zelda thing, write iconic themes and stuff. And then over time, the composer got to, actually, maybe if we have a more minimal piano, that's the best. Like sometimes that's what happens. Like I have many composers who tell me, like, for example, they may spend 2-3 years working on a game, and the first 2 years are just experimentation. And the third year is like, okay, I finally understand what the identity of this game is musically and what the game needs, and I'm gonna give it to it. And sometimes you do crazy experiments, and the last year you return to like the most minimal approach, which was the right approach all the way through. I cannot, like, when I play Zelda, when I played it the first time, I was like, no, this is great. When I play it now, I'm like, yeah, maybe I'm gonna play some music in the background, or whatever, or I'm gonna listen to an audiobook. But yeah, it grew on me. But at the same time, I'm like, I don't listen to the Zelda Breath of the Wild soundtrack as much as I used to listen to Ocarina of Time soundtrack.
Exactly.
And when I do, I listen to very specific themes as opposed to like the entire thing,
Yeah, and I think this is sort of
so
the
I'm like,
yeah, I think it's kind of the Dark Souls approach, where like, hey, we don't do music,
yeah, exactly.
and then we have the boss theme, and it hits.
But when the music kicks in,
it hits, and oh my god, do
right.
you remember that? And then
right, same Bloodborne. Like
yes, Bloodborne for sure.
There's no music for
You're right.
Yarnum, but dude, when I load Bloodborne, I hear people coughing and swearing and stuff in the background. I'm like, wow, I never heard.
That definitely helps with
and
the,
also
with hearing the environment for sure.
Yeah, and I'm ready to bet that if they decided to instead have like music in the background, they would not have put as much emphasis in the sound design. And unfortunately, the approach that I really did not like in the Soulsborne series was Elden Ring, personally.
Interesting.
Because there always is kind of like,
there's
when you're in Limgrave, there's
just this
string pad in the background that keeps going. And I feel like that kind of like, because they had that ambient music that didn't invade too much, I feel like the ambience doesn't have the same level of detail as in Bloodborne. And so they didn't do music that was too daring, and they didn't do sound design that was too daring. They did like something in between, and I was like,
I kind of agree with you there. The only weird thing with Bloodborne, but like a Souls games, the earlier Dark Souls in particular, it's like you beat a boss, right? And like, vanquished or whatever. And there's always this moment for me where it's like the inverse of sort of like, oh wow, you notice the music so much more when it's saved for like this area, the village, or this boss in particular. And then when I beat the boss, and then it just goes back to dead silence. And then I always get this feeling, I'm like, oh, so was this like an anime season budget thing? I get that feeling where it's like we they save all their animation budget for the last fight in the last episode, and everything leading up to that is very static. Because like usually when you're in a boss area and the boss is dead, usually not any sort of ambience or anything to hear. It's usually like this really dead quiet. So I get like this really weird shock, almost like cold water being doused on you. We're like, oh, we're done.
But it is like when you think of Dark Souls, right? The whole game kind of feels like that to me. It feels raw.
Well, and I think
right?
like Dark Souls is going for that. We are intentionally doing it this way. And then some games are just kind of like, hey, that was a good idea. Let's do that for our character action game. No.
Yeah, that's what I'm also kind of like. That's and I think that's bad direction. With Zelda, I think that's perfect. I personally I like it, but obviously I do miss the old approach as well.
I think. Yeah, I don't know. For me, I'm just kind of like, couldn't they have just done some themes between like snow, desert, forest? Like, I like,
dude, surely they could have done at very least. They could have done a thing where, well, they kind of did. I mean, I was about to say they could have done a thing where the instrument changes depending on the biome you're in, but it kind of did. Like when you're in the icy areas, but like this is where the question of like director vision comes in, like, because maybe the game director is like, no, I want to focus on the feeling of aloneness and post-apocalyptic world, and so I make this decision, and that is just a creative decision that makes some things good and some things not so good, and depending on what type.
With Zelda, I'll say this: it definitely feels like a creative decision. Like this was a they thought about it. and this was done intentionally.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the feeling of like I don't have the budget or the interest, where it's like if it's like some game that's like kind of like going over budget or time and like what about music? Dark Souls approach.
I don't know how. I mean, I'm sure that must have happened. I don't know how often that happens, but the idea of like, oh, Dark Souls did it, and Dark Souls is cool, so we're gonna do it as well. Like, yeah, dude, like that surely must happen a lot. But the best directors don't think that way. The best directors actually are not even, in my opinion, the best directors are not even inspired by games. Like, partially they are, but they're inspired by, like, freaking Final Fantasy was inspired by D&D. It has nothing to do with video games. Like the first few Final Fantasy games, and so many of the best games. I mean, The Last of Us. I'm ready to bet games were not the number one inspiration. Like, mix of many things and films. And to me, that's the best approach. Even with video game music, like I kind of despise a little bit when a game director's like, "Oh, I like all these tracks from previous video games. Do something like this." I'm like, why don't we try to go outside of that and bring stuff from outside to the world of game music? And that is why I love the God of War soundtrack. And I know you're not a huge fan, but God of War.
No, I think the soundtrack is amazing for that game. I do.
Right.
I'm just kind of miffed a little bit that like it feels like some games have to try harder. Like God of War is a great soundtrack, and here's the thing. You know what I'm so proud? I've told Andrew this. I'm so proud of like my weird Xenoblade fandom. No one went to Bear McCreary's Twitter after he got the award and blasted him. They left him alone because he doesn't deserve it. Because he seems like a really cool dude. Everything I've ever seen or read on this guy,
and his music is great.
And the music is great. All the whining was straight at the TGA's Twitter. I'm like, good, put it there because it's because I personally know from firsthand experience. I'm like, like it's a lot of the judges didn't even listen to all the soundtracks that year. It was just major first party. And that's the thing. Here's what made me so mad. You know what made me the most mad about that year was the fact that Bear McCreary got to go up and perform a song, his end song from that. And I'm like, that's great. No other game nominated for soundtrack got to have a personal performance. That's what made me so mad was that, we're going to come up and Bear McCreary gets to play the ending song from Ragnarok. I love that. I was excited. I'm like, are they going to do, because Oscars did it one year, I forget what year, but like, are they going to play like the main theme or like some particular track from each game nominated for music that year? Nope. We'll play a song from Diablo 4, ran as more of a marketing plug, which it was a good song, but it's like it was just kind of like it was clearly there because Activision wanted you to know Diablo 4 was coming out next year. And then one song from the soundtrack gets to play, and then it goes and wins it. But I was like, man, you saw how everyone was reacting to Pedro playing, a life sent on. Like, come on, man, like. Every single game nominated that year should have gotten its own musical piece, even if the composer wasn't able to be there. Someone could have played for them, and that's kind of what drove me the most nuts was just kind of like
you feel Xenoblade Chronicles 3 didn't get represented, and the other
all the other games too, because it's kind of like God of War has a great soundtrack, and the thing is, what I really particularly love, and I'm actually kind of it almost shocks me to remember this. Kratos' theme was created for 2018. It's not like a theme from older God of War. Bear McCreary made that theme for 2018, and he used it, for God of War. The potato or whatever, as people like to, potato.
Never heard that.
No, someone said that, and I'm like, it's like corn on the cob for Duel of Fates, and now I can't unhear it.
Oh my god.
But anyways, no, like it was just kind of like, okay, I love the fact that he did that, and he does exactly what I always want to do, which is like have a strong character theme, and it's played throughout the game and at specific moments, and it's done with specific different moods and instrumentation. And I was like, this is so great, and it kind of drove me nuts that it's like, we'll give recognition sometimes to.
I never thought about that.
To the soundtrack, and we'll play this guy's thing because Bear McCreary is probably local to LA or something,
and a name,
and I guess and a name.
Well, I think there's a thing with the game awards that I have noticed, and this could be totally baseless. It's just my opinion, but it really seems like Keighley gives more time to people who are names outside of games. It's why
Yeah,
celebrities
there-
get so
I
much
mean-
time on stage. It's why Bear
there,
McCreary
it
gets as
felt
much
like
time as he does.
yes, it felt like there were some years where he's like, I'm going to get
Little bit.
Imagine Dragons, I'm going to get Run the Jewels. And I'm
Little
like,
bit.
who should we
you
know?
know the interesting thing about the Imagine Dragons, like people
It
don't know
was
this,
for a
but
game. It
and-
was for a game.
Yeah.
no, but I don't know how much of a like Dan, the singer from Imagine Dragons, is actually a game developer. I think. Like
Is he really?
He is. I was watching like a few podcasts with him because he is a very interesting guy, and he was mentioning about how he has this side thing where he's developing a game, and I don't know if he's still doing that or if the game is that ambitious. But I'm like, oh, it's funny that people think this guy is not a gamer at all, but he kind of is involved in a way. But I don't think
Yeah.
that's why the Game Awards had him.
I
But
don't
like,
think it was. It's not necessarily. Imagine Dragons puff. It's more
no,
just.
no. But the idea of like, oh, those are big names, and that's why they get the
Yeah,
spotlight. As
they're
opposed to let's give
yeah.
a big spotlight to people who deserve it, and they're not big names yet, but we're gonna
Yeah,
make
well,
them.
he
So.
he kept
Interesting,
like for a
yeah.
couple years he would ask like who should perform at the Game Awards, and I'm like the composers of the games.
Right.
Yeah, dude, that was.
Like,
That's why when
that's what
Bear
I
performed,
kept
I was very happy.
Yeah, because
That's why I was very happy about. But I didn't think about like this Final Fantasy 16 won this year, right?
Yeah, it was.
Best score,
hmm
and did they do a performance?
No,
I don't remember.
no,
I don't think so. No.
because it wasn't in the Game of the Year nomination, right?
they only did, they only did Game of the Year.
They do a medley because he makes a big deal about like he gets a medley for all the Game of the Year nominees, and so you get about minute and a half of every game soundtrack.
Wait,
played
so
in
the
a
best,
medley.
so the best music nominees who were not in the Game of the Year did not get featured in
Correct,
the medley?
correct.
Ah,
Which is
that's
why I'm a
interesting.
little against this
Hence
whole
his
like.
anger.
Hence my little like
That's-
really like like we're
Well,
gonna play a
the-
medley.
the
I mean,
way-
I get it for Game of the Year, but I'm also kind of like you have a music category and you're not playing music from the music category with
Yeah,
your
that's
orchestra that you hired to be here. Like
the for me, like there's lots of. I think there's lots of things that could have been done better, but also at the same time, there's also good that comes out of like people are hyped,
Yes.
people are happy, and
Yeah.
I'm like, the way I see the Game Awards is the same way I see a pop song.
Yeah.
When I listen to music that is clearly made to cater to as many people as possible, I don't expect it to feed my soul as much as I expect
Mhm.
Dream Theater to feed my soul, because
It's a good
the
way to.
intention behind the intention behind the pop song is like, well, I'm gonna be as commercially viable as possible, as viral as possible, and all those things, which precludes certain choices which will be good for the soul,
Mhm.
but unfortunately are not going to be included.
Yeah.
Dude, I would fucking adore if the Game Awards gave time to developers who win the awards to be on stage and speak with the fans. I would love if the show was like 9 hours long. I would love if freaking composers got credited properly when instead of like, oh, this studio's music won. No, credit.
Oh
the
my
composer.
God! For Tears of the
I
Kingdom,
would
it was like
love-
Nintendo's sound team. I'm like, you couldn't even
Right, and
you
this, but this is
look up-
this is also like it begs the question of like, was this the Game Awards choice or Nintendo's choice? We will never know. But obviously, I would love if all these things were done like
Mm.
nicely and meticulously and all this stuff. But at the same time, I'm like, yeah, the Game Awards is meant to like be as popular and as viral as possible. So some
Yeah.
things that they don't do, maybe they don't do it because they don't want to. Maybe they don't have the money for it, or maybe they, there's. I have no idea what goes into creating an
Yeah.
event like that. So I'm
Well-
like, I share the same frustrations with you, but I'm like, yeah, I
Yeah,
guess
and
it's just,
the other thing too is, and I guess is maybe a subject for another time, is just the Game Awards getting an orchestra and playing these tracks. I'm like, this is going to be about the only time. It's so far, and here's the craziest thing: that medley in last year's, not this year, but last year's, where Pedro got like sort of infamous for his flute playing, or famous for his flute playing for Xenoblade. That is the only time Xenoblade 3 has been performed outside of the games. Like, there's been no concert in Japan for it. There's been no live performance. So the Game Award, Nintendo is my guess. So in a way, some of these games, this is the only chance we'll ever have a chance to hear like a live orchestra play some of these themes at all. Because there's this whole subject of like, I feel like game music, it's getting there where the ice is thawing a little bit with, Distant Worlds has done a lot for that, and they've had like Assassin's Creed, concerts and stuff like that. But like, I feel like there's a whole world of live musical performances of game music that still isn't really being tapped into as much as it should be. I know they have music and game festival um in the springtime over in I think Baltimore. But like it's just really it's almost like sad and interesting, but it's like yeah, like something like the Game Awards is the only time you're ever going to hear maybe a live performance of these game soundtracks because they don't get played ever again outside.
This is where I
You
want to
hear them.
plug some friends of mine because
Well, perfect time to do it. Yeah, we're at the end.
I have yeah, and I could go. Wait, what time is it? If you guys want to do half an hour more, I can do it. But if you have to go, we can end it soon. But I share with you the thought that there's loads of game soundtracks that deserve to be played and they will sound phenomenal live. And I have some friends here in Europe. They're from Poland. They're called the Game Music Foundation, and
Music.
they're a team of just guys and girls roughly our age, and they organize concerts of video game music from games that
I've heard of them for sure. Yeah.
they've done. I think Shadow of the Colossus many years ago. They've
Mhm.
done Cream Fandango. They've done a Cuphead concert where I was there. I was presenting it.
Mm.
They've done Ori, and this year they're doing The Last of Us and Baldur's Gate 3. And the way they do this is like they involve usually the composers, and they arrange the tracks in a way that is so cool and unique. And they don't have like big screens behind the orchestra. They just want you to focus on the music when you're there. And these concerts they hit on a different level because these guys love game music deeply. And this is not even their day job. They have
Wow.
different day jobs and stuff. They save money and they invested in this like game music festival concerts. And it's freaking incredible. I've been to a few of them. They're mind blowing. And when I see something at the Game Awards and I'm like, fuck, here's again one thing that could have given spotlight to smaller creators and they haven't done it. I ask myself the question, okay, can I do it? Like, because I find myself like when I think of all the shortcomings of something like the Game Awards, rather than focusing too much on like, oh, they could have done this, could have done that, I take notes to what I can do with my platform, like my YouTube channel. I'm like, okay, what videos can I do to me myself kind of be the change I wish to see in the world? And these guys at the Game Music Foundation are the ultimate example because they put together concerts
Yeah.
that are insane just because they love video game music. So I'm like,
Mhm.
you
The
know,
ultimate Thanos,
if
I'll do
all
it
the
myself.
people,
Yeah.
if all the people who write complaining to Geoff Keighley take that same energy and they put it into promoting those soundtracks themselves to their friends
Yeah,
and into buying those
That's
soundtracks,
fair.
that's gonna be
Yeah.
like a massive change already.
because that's the other thing too, where it's just kind of like it's just like the target, I guess you could say, because like he's built he wanted this, he wanted to be known as the prestigious award show or whatever. So it's kind of like the easiest thing to like like example of like where oh well, like why are we complaining about this? Because it gets the most eyes or people understand when you say something like this or whatever. In regards to like, well, why are we picking on Jeff or whatever, right?
Yeah, he's
And
easy to pick on.
I'm like, well, it's just because he has the big show, right? That he's built up. So it's like, this is like, I have to like, I guess for me, it's like I have to start somewhere. I'm like, I might as well start here or whatever. But,
Yeah, no,
but yeah,
100%. But there's people doing a lot of good, and and I agree with you. Like, I would love to see a show of the same magnitude as the Game Awards take as much responsibility as possible into showcasing like the future of our industry and the people who are the unsung heroes.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's not just job to do this. It's not technically his job to say
No,
like, I
yeah,
need to promote music or indies over here.
exactly.
Technically, um,
Exactly. But it would be nice. It would be nice. But in
yeah,
absence
it'd
of
be
that, I'm like, okay,
nice.
what I ask myself, what can I do? And that's kind of like one of the reasons why I publish the videos I do on my channel sometimes. It's like I want to give a bit more spotlight to the composers in a way that not a lot of people do. And
Right,
What
which
is
is
your YouTube channel? What's your
you have a couple. You have a couple, right?
yeah, I have 5, I think.
Yeah. Okay. 5.
Something stupid. So I actually started YouTube by making tutorials about how to write orchestral music by ear. So there's an Alex Moukala tutorial, which is my first channel. Then there's Alex Moukala Music, which is the one where I talk about video game music a lot, and that's the most popular channel. I have a channel on fashion applied to video game fashion, like, oh, how to dress like Xemnas from Kingdom Hearts 2,
Cool.
whatever.
So
But
fashion
I
is your
never
other
thought that.
love?
I guess so. I'm not sure. I like to help people. That's the thing,
Okay.
and
Cool.
I always dress in a way that for some reason reminds people about video game characters. And over time, I'm like, oh yeah, I've been drawing inspiration from games without knowing about my fashion style. And lots of people ask me, oh, where do you buy the clothes? I'm like, okay, I'm gonna make videos to teach people about fashion, um,
That's
like
sick.
gamers about fashion.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, those are
We
my
need it.
channels. Yeah, I wish I had time to like keep updating all these things, but now I'm just trying to make music for games. But my thing is like, be the change you wish to see in the world. But I share all of the concerns, and those are very great points to think about. And even that's the the topic of like game music that does not represent a game. Like the frustration we were talking about before. I'm like, that's why I wanted to be on this podcast, because I want to talk about game music with you. And I'm like, what can I learn from people who love game music as a composer? Because you're literally my target audience. There's one game specifically where I want to send you an NDA later on and have you give
I'm
me
very
feedback on the
familiar with
music
NDAs, so
to understand. Yeah, I want to get the Simmons seal of approval, because this game in particular. Well, the trailer of this game is already out. The trailer of the game is the game is called Second Son, and the trailer is on YouTube. And we interestingly, when we published the trailer, we just published footage from the game and the music underneath it. We didn't add anything, no text,
Cool.
no description, and people in the comments wrote, "Oh, this reminds me of this, reminds me of that, reminds me of this other game," and it was mind blowing because some of those games that people mentioned in the comments are kind of our inspiration stylistically.
Cool.
Some of them, not all of them, but there's been some that are like, how did people freaking guess this just from the trailer and just from the music?
Well, that's
Right.
validating too. That's really cool.
Yeah, and for that one, I can't talk about anything.
Right.
But I'd love to get your feedback on the music if possible. I'll have to see if the guys are open to that or whatever in the future. But yeah, I think it's important to have these conversations that you like.
Yeah,
Like this dialogue between developers and fans that's one of the things that I wish stuff like the Game Awards facilitated even more.
Yeah,
because it's very precious.
And for me, though, what I really like is, it's funny how you mentioned earlier. I didn't say this, but like you said, like how orchestral is your favorite, and that's absolutely my favorite type of music too. My favorite instrument when it comes to sort of like general, pop rock, bass. I like bass a lot. Like so, bass.
Oh hell yeah!
Who doesn't
So I
love
have
bass? Yeah.
So I have this weird thing where it's just like, oh, what instrument would you like to, if you were in a rock band, would you play? I like to play bass. Like I like the bass line of
Hell
songs.
yeah,
Like
dude.
a really good bass line to me, like anyways. But I guess for me though, like I was saying, for general feedback is, I particularly love music that tells a story. Even if it's not the story intended, I listen to the music and I formulate it and I play it in my, and like I'm going on an emotional journey, not a flat line, but like a wavelength of like like I it's bringing like back memories, like if you walk around somewhere and you gain a scent, and like here, like a weird one is like sometimes I'll be walking around somewhere and I'll smell a scent of like a linen thing, of a particular type of laundry, whatever, right? And I'll have that ratatouille effect where it goes back to my brain, where I remember
Dude,
being a
that's
kid.
literally the way my brain works too.
Right.
That's crazy.
So music does the same thing, where like if I hear,
Yeah.
especially if it's a song I haven't heard in a while, and I come back and I'll just ratatouille, I'll zoom back to that thing. So I like to have memories and like in stories kind of like etched into the melody, of a song. And I want, and that's what I want, for most of the music I listen to. And that's what I really particularly look for in a game is just kind of like, can I listen to this and will I go, am I being told a story as it happens? And for me, like, you know, like there's something that to me that like hit me the hardest. There's this guy, I forget where he is, but he was like a music composer, and he doesn't play games necessarily or whatever, but people made him listen to full soundtracks so he could react. And he was listening to he listened to every single track all the way through of all the games. For some reason, the poor bastard listened to people's idea to do Xenoblade 2, which is an enormous soundtrack. And he's listening to the whole thing, and he gets to the end because there's this like critical, you know, one of Mitsuda's best songs, honestly, ever. And the guy just starts breaking down in tears, and he starts sobbing.
Wait, which song is that?
Tomorrow with You.
Yeah.
And then there's Departing, which is played right before it, which doesn't get as much. I think it's Departing. I might be misremembering that all, but like he gets to that part because
it's the final songs. Yeah,
it's down in the end, but it because it uses. It's funny because they use the leitmotif of the ending song, which hasn't even played yet. He hasn't even gotten that, but he's heard this theme kind of been woven into a lot of tracks leading up to this part. But then you get to a really emotional moment. Parting, yes, Parting is the name of the track, and the guy just starts breaking down, and he's just sobbing in tears because he's gone on a musical journey. All he's done is listen to the music. He's not played the game. He has no idea what's going on in the story. He just was sitting there and just listening to it, and he went on a journey, and then like he got to the emotional climax, and then it just broke him down. And he was talking about like this is like, you know, what composers always are looking for this moment, like to create something that is so resonating, like a theme so resonating that like you play it a certain way or don't get to this point, and it's just like, oh, you know, it just breaks you down. And that's kind of like, you know, that's kind of like what I always like look for in a game is just kind of like, it doesn't have to break me down in tears. You know, it could definitely just, I could be like tapping my toe or snapping my fingers, like just something that I want something to give me a story and something that I can remember it by and just be like World 1, 2, you know, or you know, whatever. Like, oh yeah, because it's like you hear Yoshi, like Super Mario World, like you hear the athletic theme as it's called. And you're like, oh yeah, that's so great. It's a ragtime style expression because Kondo's real big into that and bluegrass and whatever. And you hear that and it's like, oh, I remember this world. And then what comes with the memory of hearing this song? I recognize where it's from. I remember the first time I heard it. I remember being a kid. I remember being a kid playing that game with my friends. And then like your whole life starts to like immediately piece together like a puzzle completing itself, you know, with with that one music trigger. And it's just like all of a sudden it's like you know, I'm back being a kid, you know, hanging out with my friends after school or whatever, and we're all just trying to see how far we can get in Mario World, or we're hanging out at the store where the demo unit's playing. This is our only means to access the game because we can't afford the game or the system yet. So but we heard this so much, you know, so like that to me is what I'm always looking for in a game soundtrack is to take me on that sort of journey, you know, and leave a memory, you know, with it. And oh my god, man, if I want to talk about it too, man, like I could go
Dude,
into like
I'll tell you a story that
yeah,
you just made me think about. Similar example. I am extremely fucked up as a person, apparently, because I'm not. Well, this is getting better over time as I age, but for the longest time, I haven't been able to cry. Like, I had a period from 10 years old until 24, where I haven't spilled a single tear for anything that happened to me.
Yeah.
Not that I didn't have fucked up things happen to me. I did, but like any other human. But I wasn't able to cry. And then I went to a Final Fantasy concert, the first time ever. It was Distant Worlds, and they were playing many themes. And the two Final Fantasies that are the most related to my childhood are Final Fantasy 8 and 7. And my childhood is one of the happiest periods of my life. And that day, I kind of felt it washing over me like it hadn't done ever since I was 10. And that happened when they were playing the FS7 main theme, and they were, you know, I already kind of was almost bawling when that kicked in.
Which
and
then get enough recognition. I'll just say that.
Yeah.
And I don't know. And so they were playing that, and then they put like there was a massive screen behind them, and they put like a gameplay of like Cloud walking around the world map, and that, like, you know, it was like a insane, you know, moment, Ratatouille moment for me, and I started bawling like a baby very quick. And it had been 14 years of me not crying, but that did it. like the music from FS7, and it
because
reminded me to.
yeah, and it's such an emotional song. It's so good too because everyone remembers One Winged Angel and stuff like that, right? But just the main theme with the slow build up with the strings, because it's got this sort of sadness, but also like everything's gonna be okay feel to the song.
Yeah,
And
it's pretty.
that's
It's a
why that
lot.
main I feel like that main theme is so good because of the heavy environmentalist message of that game and just sort of like how things feel like like feels like nothing overwhelming things can never get better, like we can nothing can, but that like that theme is sort of like it's like sort of I feel like a weird theme of like sort of hope in a weird sort of way because you
Yeah,
hear it
and
the
it couldn't.
first time you leave Midgar is when you first hear it, and it's like you've
Yeah,
left this dystopian diesel punk hellhole, and the world kind of opening up to you, and it kind of feels like no, there's still beauty in the world, kind of thing.
yeah,
That's
but
such a good theme too. I don't know.
interestingly, that theme could not have been made if they didn't let themselves experiment. Because like, how long? It's like 5-6 minutes long or something like
Yeah,
that.
it's about a 6 to 7 minute long track, I
And I
think.
think until that point, like the older Final Fantasies did not have a
Yeah.
world map theme that had such a long loop.
No, yeah.
So obviously it didn't because they were all on SNES.
Yeah.
So the amount of
Memory
like
and everything. Yeah.
size was limited in the cartridge. But also, I feel like when they wrote that and they made that game, they weren't thinking about, I need to do something like the previous one. They were like, let's do something new. And this is where I'm like, it's hard for me to, like, creativity in video games is so weird because on one side you want to respect traditions and you want to like give nods to the game before that you grew up playing, but at the same time, like, if we're only concerned with that, we're never gonna discover themes like the FS7 main theme, because
And
if I only
Right.
play by the rules set by precedently, there's no fucking way that I'm gonna have the same insight that Uematsu had back when he was like, let me write a 6 minutes long world map. It's fucking ridiculous.
and it has like a really sinister part, and
Yeah.
and then there's so much
It's
going
pretty
on there.
creepy.
But like
Yeah.
also, you're right, where I've said too, like people kind of become sort of like trapped in their nostalgia, and
Yeah.
I feel like it kind of it takes you you're limiting yourself. You're doing yourself a disservice by not, if you only kind of like gravitate towards things you remember or familiar with in the past, because then you're going to miss out on. And the thing is, I don't like the games per se of, say, Persona, but oh my god, those soundtracks are fire, right?
Yeah, dude.
Like the gameplay loop of Persona to me is a little too slow and
Mm.
and stuck in one place. But like I'm so glad that like I still listen or played the game a little bit, gave it a chance, because then it's like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna hear, you hear that music, you're like, oh yeah,
Interestingly,
this is some fire.
Persona. I mean, Persona is such a great example for me because, like, Persona is a game whose soundtrack, not game. Persona is a series whose soundtracks are so freaking cool, but also some of them are kind of flawed, and that makes them cooler. So,
Yeah.
for example, uh, Persona Portable, like Persona 1, I think there was a remake of Persona 1, Persona Portable.
Mhm.
I don't know if you guys are familiar with the soundtrack.
Well,
Not of that
I've
one,
only
no.
ever played PS1 version, so not the PSP one.
Right. So the Persona Portable soundtrack has I think the soundtrack was written specifically for that one, like a new one. And
Mhm.
there's some themes that are freaking incredible, and they have vocals, which, if I'm not wrong, are sang by a Japanese vocalist. And
Mhm.
her pronunciation is not perfect, but she's singing in English, and she's singing with like a I don't even know what it sounds like, a person trying to speak English, but they don't know English perfectly,
Right.
and you feel it clearly. You're like, I don't understand what the lyrics are saying. And some people are like seeing that as a bad thing, like, oh, that's a bad attempt. But for me, I'm like, this imperfection adds like a sound that I've never heard anywhere else. Oh,
Right.
actually, I
Oh,
did.
right.
Another game, The World Ends With You. The
Oh
first
yeah.
one has
I
the
was
same.
I
There's
literally was showing people that game soundtrack last night on my stream, and I was just
dude.
shocked at how many people are like, I've never heard this game.
Dude,
Or
what the?
and a couple people are like,
it's
well,
crazy.
I've heard of it, but I never played it. I'm like, and that's why it's dead.
Yeah, but
Congrats.
freaking incredible game. And even that one has some tracks that are like, there's some Japanese singers who are not pronouncing perfectly, and that gives the game the sound that is so unique. And even I
Mhm.
don't care, it's not perfect pronunciation, it sounds cooler to me. It sounds fresh. And Persona 5 instead, like, the singer is flawless in every way. The tracks that are kind of flawed in Persona 5 are, in my opinion, surprisingly, I didn't realize this until recently. I was listening to
Was it a last
the
surprise?
nicely played. No, that one though is perfect. But I was listening to one of the tracks I like the most, which is one that plays at the end of the game, the final boss theme. There's a moment where you're about to, hit the boss with a finishing blow, where a specific track comes in, and it's sort of like grandiose, epic orchestra that ends with a very intimate piano, and the piano is playing the leitmotif that you heard the entire game, and it's the leitmotif that plays in the most heartwarming moments when you have a heart to heart with the characters and your friends, and it's like every time you hear it, it's so uplifting and so alive and stuff. But at the end, on the piano, sounds so different and nostalgic, and you're like, the piano's telling you you're at the end of the journey. You just made it here because of your friends, kind of. And
Interesting.
it comes after this grandiose orchestra, and so the contrast of that is even stronger. But interestingly, when I heard that track, I'm like, dude, that was the track I liked the most in the game. But when I listened to it recently, I was like, oh wow, the orchestra is actually not that realistic. It's like samples. It's not
Yeah.
real performance, and it's written in a way that I'm like, it's very raw compared to like the funky tracks, which are alive because they're real performance.
Right.
And I'm like, wow,
Interesting.
this is
So it
actually,
uses
the orchestration here is actually not that good, but the
Mm,
track is fucking insane. It's
yeah.
so evocative. And
It
the
reminds me so much of one of my favorite boss themes, which is the Shadow Lord. I don't know if
interestingly,
I don't know if
I
you've
much
played
prefer
that.
Shadowless Castle.
Right, I don't
I
know.
much
Well,
prefer
just
Shadowless Castle.
it's more this how when you're doing the final hits and it starts taking
Yeah.
away instruments, and then the final
Yeah,
hit
that
is
Nier does that. Yeah,
yeah,
Nier is
and then
amazing
the
with that.
final hit is just playing a music box version because you're removing because
Yeah,
you're
dude.
it's like you're removing it because you're removing song from the world. Like there's a whole thematic thing
Yeah.
that goes back to Drakengard 1 with it. I'm like, this is brilliant.
Yeah,
Like
dude. Like
the
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 music.
final it goes minimalist instead of like building up because like you're technically you don't realize it, but you're doing a
Yeah,
bad thing.
you're doing a very bad thing.
And
Uh,
I don't know, it's
uh,
like just what a
dude,
cool idea.
my favorite thing in Nier is the track is called the Ultimate Weapon.
Mhm.
It's the one that plays in Emil's basement thing. Like, when you go to
Oh,
Emil's house and you go in the basement and you discover things, and
yeah, and it's like
at the
the
start the track is kind of
overhead.
creepy, but the deeper you go, the sadder it gets.
Mhm.
That track and its implementation is one of the best music implementation in games I've experienced in a long time. And it's kind of like same idea as the Shadow Lord's theme, but kind of in a different way.
Yeah, like
And
the going in, like because again, it's kind of telling the story as like you get further down this
mhm,
rabbit hole, the worse, like the more
that
changes and
yeah, and when I hear the track, I go through that entire journey again, and I'm like, oh my god, Emil's story is so fucked up. Like it makes
yeah, it
me feel
is.
so sad, and that to me is so much more important than sounding cool. So much more
Yeah,
important, you know. Like that's why I like Japanese soundtracks a lot. But I'm not saying that Western soundtracks don't have that. They do. Uh, but there's some soundtracks that put more emphasis on sounding proper and some that put more emphasis on telling a story, and my favorites are the ones that fall exactly in the middle.
mm.
uh
I just wish that I feel like I just wish we got more music out of a lot of Western gaming and that it was implemented more because I get where some games where it's kind of like you want the ambience, and then some games is to me I'm just kind of like, why is it silent? Like I want to I want to feel something here. Dang it!
all
So
right, so let me ask you a closing question. uh do you by chance have an idea of like a story you'd like to write for a game? Like, maybe do you have an imaginary game in your mind that you've been thinking, oh, I would love to create a game like this? Like,
oh sure,
do you have something like that?
yeah, sure, absolutely.
Are you willing to share some of it? like the main idea? Because I'm wondering, like, if you had a game at your fingertips, how you would go about the musical choices you would make.
Original or based off an existing IP?
Up to you. You can take a game that we know and that we played or whatever, and tell me how you would have approached the music differently, or you can tell me about an imaginary game and how you would like the music to be addressed in it. Because I'm very curious, like, what a Siemens directed musical. Like,
Well, okay, so
sounds
like
like.
let's say original. I mean, it would be easier to say like what I would do because I have a very particularly planned out Zelda game in my head. But like, but if
Okay.
an original
Well,
game,
we can go with the Zelda game if you want. I just want to hear your take on music of a game that.
so for Zelda, okay, I guess okay. For an original game, my idea is very much to take. I want it aesthetically to be unique, as well as like as well as musically, of course. Where but yeah, I guess I'll just talk Zelda because it'll be easier for people to grasp what I'm saying here rather than trying to describe a whole scenario. Um, for Zelda, I would particularly like something along the lines I would like to do a collab musically with Zelda. I would like to take someone like David Wise and some of his more
Mm,
recent stuff for like Tropical Freeze, Snake Pass, stuff like that, which is a more I want to say not new age, but just sort of like there's an interesting quality because it's not very bombastic at all. It's very moody and environmental and vibey, right? And I think he should do field themes. And I think it would be really interesting to get certain other people for town themes.
mm,
Like maybe like a Yoko Shimomura going for because
mm,
I think Yoko Shimomura does really good. Ace, obviously, Kenji Hiramatsu from Xenoblade, they do amazing town themes. So I'm like something like that, and then I definitely would want something like Mitsuda, to do more like event, scenario kind of things. Maybe have a main theme going, something like
mm,
that. Like in my head, if I was doing like say a Zelda game, and I would actually like for me, I would personally like to see a sort of east west collab like that, like very intentionally, because I would
mm,
actually very much like to see like the vibes because like yes I know he we're talking about a game with like big gorilla and like a snake or whatever like that David Wise has done, but like remove that, like listen to something like Seashore War from Tropical Freeze, like the very it's with like the guitar and sort of like some of the other like low key strings whatever. I think that
mhm,
would be great. I want to see like that, in placed in the environments they're going for now with Zelda in particular.
mm,
And for me, I very much want there to be because like what a lot of sort of JRPG composers do is they have an ending theme. That ending theme tends to have connections to the overall theme of the whole game, and they'll put that in little moments like a lot of like scenario cutscenes, event scenes, or just generally in somewhere like Final Fantasy 9 put it in its world map theme,
yeah.
with the ending. So I actually want that because for me, like when it comes to like doing musical direction like that, it's like I want basically you to sort of remember the world. I want like, I want everything to be like not a buffet, but just sort of like in Chrono Cross when you hear Home Village, the Home Village theme, and there's alternate versions for each theme because there's two different timelines or whatever. But like
Mhm,
that is the ultimate like home theme. It's not just the fact that like, oh, it's the Southeast Asian, like, homes on stilts over water. So you would think, oh, we'll play a lot of music there. No, he goes a completely other direction, and he does a lot of Celtic based themes for a game that has no real Celtic look to most of its environments at all. But it's like this is your home theme, and you need to feel like this is where I grew up, kind of home. So it's like stuff like that is where I'm like, I want like things to sort of match the vibe and match the story as much as possible. For
mm,
me, like in a game, it's like I want there to sort of like when you listen to it, there's like layers to it where it's like this is a vibe. This is also very particular about where we are in the story and what we're trying to tell, and kind of like if possible, kind of always try to to tie that back to the central core theme or ideology of the game. If your game has a theme or an ideology or a message, I realize not a lot of games do, and it's not
all the best games do. All the best games do.
like not a requirement. I understand.
All the best art has something to say.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think that's actually Andrew. That's a very good way to put it. Like, I want the music to feel like it has something to say, or like it's tying back to the game, which has something to say. Because, and obviously a platformer doesn't need that. I get it, but like, when it comes to something like Zelda, I actually want Zelda to leave me to have a little. I want to go through a range of emotions in Zelda and not just overcome challenge. Overcome next challenge.
Do you think that's because you grew up with it, so you have like as you developed a sense of connection to that game, and so you want it to develop with you? I always wonder about games we grow up with. We want to read more emotion into it.
Very, very good question, and I would only counter argument because Link's Awakening story is like
definitely
is very deep, but you don't notice it as a kid.
It's also an outlier.
Yeah, it's an outlier, and I didn't notice it as a kid, but it is a game I had, and as a game I played a lot. And then, kind of like coming back to it, you realized that they were putting stuff into it. Majora's Mask, another good example, where like you play and you're like, oh, the side quest is very memorable and sad, but it's like, did you know that side quest was inspired because they had a coworker at Nintendo who was getting married, but they were under threat of being bombed by North Korea, but they decided to go ahead with their wedding anyways, even if it was going to be their last day on Earth. They still wanted to get married, and that's what inspired the whole quest line for Cafe and Anju and Majora's Mask. And I'm like, that's what I want in Zelda. I want stuff that's like it like there's like this deep-seated meaning behind it, or it's just like, I don't care if it's the last day or not. I want to spend it with you. I want to, get married to you, kind of thing. Stuff like that is if I could have a game where it's like it's fine to just kind of play through it on surface level, but like when you look into it more, you start peeling back layers. Like the Face Shrine in Link's Awakening is a good example. You go in there and it like there's two themes. There's the dungeon Face Shrine and there's a southern Face Shrine where you get the big plot revelation about the game. And as people point out, it's like it's a slower, more darker, haunting melody when you just go into this 2-room little area and you realize you get the big plot twist. And I'm like, yeah, they did that on purpose because you're kind of coming to this horrible realization that what your quest is not actually good for the people living on the island. Kind of like that's like almost like a bit of a near moment. But you don't notice that as a kid. You're like, oh wow, it's a scary new dungeon. Yeah, the music is sort of haunting, and then it's like, no, it was intentionally done. And then they play a variation of that when you get to the main dungeon right after Face Shrine South to the north, where it's like, and they did this really beautifully in the remake, where like they made it even more poignant and haunting as you're going through the dungeon, because like, yeah, the dungeon comes right after the plot revelation, and that's why it's got this sort of like somber, almost like haunting melody, because it's supposed to be like you, the player, are realizing what you're doing. Oh God, I'm going to make this world vanish. Like my quest is not noble.
Well, sound in general is anchoring, right? Like, so in film, you use sound to anchor edits, to anchor emotions. And I think the best music in games and movies are songs that anchor you to a specific emotion in a specific moment within the story. So I think maybe a way of doing that atmospherically is like if you connect the day-night cycle, like you were saying, like in area themes, if you connect the day-night cycle to literally, how the sun and moon is going, like where it crescendos or where certain aspects happen, in a 24-minute piece of music that changes literally by the position of the sun and moon and where you are on the map, could be a good way of doing what you're saying, is like anchoring emotion to location.
Yeah,
when you go into dungeons or you go into towns, it's going to be its own music because civilization, life is there. But out in the actual like world map, it'd be a good way to anchor, or at least in my own mind. That's sorry, that's just when you were saying that, it was popping into my head where I was like,
and I think another thing I really like too is when they use different instruments for different areas of the world. to sort of signify you're in a different spot. We're not just or maybe we emphasize the music, because like it is for Sea of Stars, where like there's this one water village with like this like sea creature people live there, and like Eric Brown said, like, or I heard from one of the other devs, they're like, yeah, they use a lot of bells. Bells was sort of like the background because they have bells in their village, right, and stuff like that. So you ring a bell to like to awaken the village, kind of thing. So it's like, yeah, there's a lot of bells in the background here. We're going to use different instruments over here, like a hurdy-gurdy over here in the sea town or whatever. And I kind of like that too, not to sort of like just sort of like stereotype areas, but like find creative ways. Again, like with the Chrono Cross example of like, it's a game heavily based on the structures, buildings of Southeast Asia and the islands there, but it uses completely it's almost entirely Celtic based for its soundtrack. Different instruments, different Celtic instruments, but it's just kind of like we're not tying an instrument to a place, where it's just kind of like this would be, just figuring out like what evokes, the strongest, character, what brings out the character of the environment most with what instrument, kind of thing. And not just because I think it's kind of like speaks a little bit back to what you said, Alex, where like some people are like, I don't like orchestra because it's a sound wall, just a wall of sound, where like, oh, the orchestra sounds the same everywhere you go, even if it is a different track. Where if someone's not writing it correctly, because they're just sort of like, write a bunch of strings and trumpets and call it a day.
There are many ways to like make an orchestra sound unique and different, but many people don't take advantage of that. But I do agree, like the best games have a strong identity, even just in the instruments they use or the genres, the style they use. And the best scenario you can imagine from a game that you're working on is people using like people discovering a new genre of music thanks to your game. Persona 5 is the best great example.
Oh, 100%.
Lots of people discovered funk with it and discovered jazz, which has nothing to do with Persona 5, but for some reason, I know for what reason they say it's Persona 5 music. It's because the harmonies in jazz, like, the chords and stuff are...
I was told Persona 5 is acid jazz.
It's acid jazz. Yeah, which is very different from like normal jazz.
Right.
And
it's not the same.
I find acid jazz is a bit closer to funk than it's just by... Actually, I don't freaking know. Like it's okay. Acid jazz and Japanese fusion jazz are the two genres that are very like the Persona 5 is based on. And I love that lots of people discover those genres and discover jazz also, or whatever, or funk by virtue of Persona 5. That's the best thing you can hope for as a game composer, in my opinion, is to people to associate, like to like discover a brand new type of music thanks to your game or your soundtrack. And I think all best soundtracks, not all the best soundtrack, but lots of great soundtracks are rooted in a musical language that is pretty unique, and is used in a way that also conveys a lot of emotion. Like, it's not easy to be like, okay, I'm gonna make this entire soundtrack sound Celtic and write a soundtrack that still sounds interesting despite using always the same instruments.
Or like highlighting different types of instruments, within like one genre.
But if you nail it, like you're a freaking legend, and like Persona 5 comes to mind, Doom comes to mind. There's lots of soundtracks that have a strong identity that sets them apart, even just from the sounds that are being used.
That's the thing, is you hear it and you'd be like, that's definitely that kind of thing.
Yeah, in my opinion, that's
the goal.
That's the goal, but unfortunately it's not always possible depending on the director's vision. Some directors are like, no, I just want to hear all my favorite things I heard growing up merged into one in my project. And other directors are more like focused on developing a musical identity that's unique to the game. And
I think like you said but earlier, where it's like, if I was directing, my thing would be like, if I chose a composer, I would say, here's everything, scenario, plot, and art. Whatever art is done is done. My direction would just be like, surprise me. Like, and just walk away with it and just be like, I don't, whatever. And unless unless I really hate it, it would just be like, just surprise me. I don't want to sit here and tell a musician,
very like, and that's in my opinion, that's a great director. Like a director who tells you in their words, like, all you need to know about the game, and then if you ask them questions, they answer you, but they don't answer to you in musical terms like, oh, I like use this instrument, do this with the melody or whatever, but they tell you this is the emotion that I want people to feel. This is what this character goes through. This is what this means in terms of story. Like the best directors, in my opinion, talk in terms of story and emotions and metaphors, and they don't.
Yeah, this reminds me of a lot of. I saw this as a kid in an interview on TV, and every year I used to go see John Williams perform at the Hollywood Bowl. He still does.
Oh man.
So this is probably why I'm like so orchestrally bent. But like he in a TV interview, he was talking about Jaws, and he said like I first played the theme to Jaws to Steven Spielberg. He hated it, and I said no, just think about it. Just wait, dun, you know, dun 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 dun. And I remember that interview so distinctly, and I remember reading interviews same with George Lucas for the original Star Wars. They both did not like at all what John Williams brought to the table. Initially with Jaws, with the sort of the strings of the piano, just like the shark hunting, and Lucas was like, why don't we just do a bunch of more like electronica synthesizer, and he was like no, trust me, orchestra, use classical instruments, it'll work. And I remember thinking how they both were like, yeah, he was completely right, and that always struck with me, which was like, you get a good composer and they come with you with some wild twist, go with it.
Believe them. I mean, Final Fantasy X,
right?
Final Fantasy X's battle theme was
Final
notoriously not.
Final Fantasy X's opening, not the title screen, but the another world awaits you. I'm like, what? Like,
yeah,
I mean, but boy, do you remember it, and boy, does it fit that scene.
Oh yeah, and like I'm sure, like I think I read somewhere that the battle theme, many employees didn't like it, but Uematsu was like, trust me. It's
interesting.
Like it has some very interesting bass lines. Fucking great. It's very different.
Really?
But different doesn't. Yeah. It was
Didn't
too
like
new.
it
was too different. Many developers didn't. I don't know if that includes Sakaguchi, but many developers didn't like it. Apparently, I think I read it in an interview.
That's it.
And then over time, it grew on people. And that's the risk of.
Yeah, and I would have gone with it just because that game was so different stylistically, like setting wise too. Like it'd be like, we have something really different. Yeah, well, we're doing everything different, so just go with it.
Exactly. Well, I'm sure Sakaguchi was like fine with it. But yeah, dude, like that was an interesting answer.
We really appreciate you being here. Obviously, we were both very excited by this, but you guys could talk for hours and hours, and this is the longest episode we've ever done.
So, oh my god!
Sorry
for the audience.
No, we're definitely gonna have to have you on again, especially.
Yeah, we got to wrap
up. I think there's gonna be a game coming where we all love the music. We're gonna want to talk about it, and I think maybe we'll do like a specific game sometime, where we'll talk specifically about that game's music and kind of like deep dive into why it worked, how it worked, what it did for
Final Fantasy VII Rebirth.
Let's
do it. And also, like, I'd like to, like let's see if the people like this episode as well, like the people on your podcast, your audience, if they hate it. Let's maybe do it in private. If they like it, we can do more, and I can come back when some of my games come out. But I wanted to do a shout out, and I said it before we started recording. I have a shout out for some friends of mine, which is aimed directly at Simmons. I want to shout out the best Chrono Trigger cover I ever heard in my life.
Oh, really?
Okay. It's and I'm like,
I
guess it's polarizing because it's very maximalist. It's a maximal, like it's all over the place in the most beautiful way to me. It's a cover of the main theme, and it's by a friend of mine's band. My friend is Mason Lieberman, and the band is Tournament Arc. If you go on Spotify, search for Tournament Arc. I think that the name of the track is main theme, literally, and it's the main theme from Chrono Trigger. Check it out. It's fucking insane, and I freaking love it. It's all over the place. It's super virtuosistic. It's so much fun, and goes to show once again how freaking incredible of a theme that one is.
Featuring
that's what
featuring Zach Zinger and Dom Palombi.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
That's the one.
I'll see if I can link to it.
Go check it out. Yeah.
The thing about Chrono Trigger, I don't know if you noticed this, someone made a remix album, a jazz album of Chrono Trigger, and Mitsuda commented on it, even though I don't think it was official, or no, maybe it was official from Square. He's like, everyone thinks Chrono Trigger is meant for orchestra. I actually wrote it as a jazz. He's like, its roots are jazz. He says, like, its roots are jazz. Yeah, well, I don't know if it's a big band, but he said the roots of it are actually jazz, not orchestral.
Yeah. That's
then
very clear.
and he's like, I never thought about that in my head. And then I listened to some of the tracks from him. I'm like, oh yeah, this thing was totally just jazz. It was that meme of the astronauts or whatever. He's like, wait, Chrono Trigger's always been,
It was jazz all
always
along.
has been.
Dude,
I was like,
JRPG
bro.
music in general, JRPG music in general is very inspired by jazz and rock.
Yeah.
Not that much by, I mean, also orchestral, but not as much as people would guess.
Yeah, like
Anyway,
Persona
guys,
kind of
it's
opened that up, but yeah.
Thank you so much for
And
being here. We really
it's been a
appreciate
pleasure.
it. And we'll again, we're gonna have you on specifically about Rebirth. You committed to it. People are expecting it now.
Yeah, no.
I'm looking forward to it.
We'll talk to you soon.
Man, that game's gonna be great.
All right. Cheers, guys. Bye. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Big thank you to Alex again. And as always, we have producers to thank. If you're interested in becoming a patron at any level, please check out patreon.com/YoVideogames podcast. Due to the week was LCL Mayhem, and our producers for this episode are Mutton Chops Johnson, Scrunami, Koroi35, Hyper Viper 89, LCL Mayhem, and Ziggy Z. Thank you, dudes, and we'll catch you next time.
Later, dudes.